Before the video starts, hit like and leave any comment. Our goal is 1,000 likes and 1,000 comments. Thank you, and now let's begin. My name is Dakota. I've worked for the National Park Service for 15 years, but I'd never felt as desperate as I did in September when the position became available. The transfer request came across my desk at the regional office in Bozeman, and I knew the moment I read the posting that I needed to get away from everything. Not everyone understands what it means to live in a place where everyone knows your name, where everyone watches, where every failure in your personal life becomes community gossip. My divorce had been finalized 3 months earlier, and staying in that town felt like wearing a scarlet letter. Glacier National Park had an opening for a seasonal ranger at Takoshinakapi Wilderness Station, a remote outpost on the eastern shore of a lake most tourists never see. The station consisted of a single log cabin built in 1987, a small dock, and maybe 20 square miles of monitored backcountry. The previous ranger, Marcus, had left abruptly in June, taking a job with the BLM in Nevada. The position was remote enough that it demanded independence, and isolated enough that it promised anonymity. For me, it was perfect. I arrived on a Tuesday in early September, driving my Forest Service truck up the winding mountain road that dead-ended at the parking area. The lake sprawled before me like something from another world. Takoshinakapi, the locals called it. The name came from Blackfeet tradition, meaning place where the waters listen. Even then, in broad daylight with the September sun painting the peaks gold, something about that name unsettled me. The cabin was exactly what I expected. A single-room structure with a wood stove, a cot, a desk, a radio, and supplies. The walls were solid pine, the windows covered with thick shutters that hadn't been closed in months. Dust lay thick on every surface. There was no electricity, no running water beyond what we could pump from the lake through a filtered system, and no cell service. The nearest town was Kalispell, 40 minutes away by truck if the mountain roads didn't get washed out. For the first week, I cleaned. I scrubbed the cabin until my hands bled, beat the dust from the wool blankets, organized the supply closet, tested the radio, it crackled with static and the distant voices of other stations, and established my routine. I walked the perimeter trail each morning, checked for hazards, logged observations about wildlife sightings and weather conditions. The job was simple: maintain the station, monitor the backcountry, assist lost hikers, document unusual activity. I was supposed to patrol the trails twice weekly, maintain the dock, and file reports every 10 days. Everything was ordinary. The mountains were beautiful in that way that makes you feel small. The lake water was clear enough to see 10 feet down in places, and cold enough that even in September swimming was only something you did on purpose. The forest surrounding us consisted of dense lodgepole pine mixed with Douglas fir, with occasional clearings where the aspens had turned that strange, fragile gold. I settled into the rhythm of the work easily. I hiked the North Trail on Mondays and Thursdays. I checked the southern perimeter on Wednesdays. Fridays I spent maintaining equipment and filing reports. Weekends I allowed myself to rest, to sit on the cabin's small porch and watch the water change colors as the light moved across it. The isolation I'd craved wrapped around me like a comfortable blanket. For the first time in years, I slept without dreaming. The quiet was absolute in a way that city people never understand. It wasn't the absence of sound, it was the presence of specific, natural sounds: wind through pine, water against shore, the creak of the cabin as it settled. My mind, which had been racing for so long, finally began to slow. October arrived with the smell of frost and dying leaves. The aspens turned entirely gold, then red, then shed their needles like water running downhill. I maintained the trail system, cleared fallen deadfall that could block the paths, and documented the wildlife patterns. I saw elk moving through the high meadows, mountain goats picking their way along the steep ridges, and the occasional mule deer browsing in the clearings. Everything followed the expected patterns. On October 22nd, the first strange thing happened. I was walking the North Trail in the late afternoon, maybe 4 miles from the cabin, when I came around a bend and found an elk carcass beside the trail. Nothing unusual about that except for how it had been positioned. The animal was a young bull, maybe 3 years old, and it had been arranged deliberately, its legs folded beneath its body, its head tucked downward as if it were sleeping, its body oriented toward the water even though we were nearly a mile from any lake. The arrangement was too deliberate to be natural. Animals don't position themselves this way after death. Predators don't arrange their kills into peaceful poses. I examined the body carefully, documenting everything in my notebook. No visible wounds, no decomposition beyond what I'd expect for an animal dead maybe 3 to 4 days. The hide was intact except for a strange pattern of marks on the right flank, 3 parallel lines, each maybe 2 inches long, as if something with 3 talons had gripped the animal. The marks weren't deep enough to be from a bear or mountain lion. They looked almost deliberate, almost like scratches made to leave a signal. I reported it on my radio to the station supervisor in Kalispell, and he instructed me to leave the body where it was. Natural occurrence, he said, though I could hear the doubt in his voice. Take photos and move on. Predator behavior can seem unusual if you're not used to it. I wasn't new to predator kills. I'd seen plenty of deer taken by mountain lions, elk crippled by wolves, smaller animals torn apart by bears. This was different in a way I couldn't articulate. I filed my report and continued my patrol, but I found myself looking over my shoulder more than usual. The second incident came 2 days later. I was collecting water from the lake using the pump system when I noticed something odd in the water near the dock. At first I thought it was a beaver or a muskrat, but the shape was wrong. It was moving in a pattern too deliberate, too aware, circling in the shallows 20 feet from the dock. I grabbed the binoculars from the cabin and watched it for nearly 5 minutes. I couldn't identify it. The body was elongated, pale, the movement almost serpentine, and there was something about the head that caught my eye. It seemed too large, proportional wrong. When I lowered the binoculars, it had vanished. I told myself it was probably just a fish I didn't recognize, but that explanation felt thin. Fish move with the water, their motion guided by current and instinct. Whatever I'd seen was moving with intention, with purpose. It had been circling, and when I stopped watching, it had fled, as if aware that I was observing it. The third sign came that night. I was lying in the cabin, reading a book by lamplight, a mystery novel that someone had left behind, when I heard the sound. It started as something distant, a long, drawn-out note that seemed to come from the forest to the north. At first I thought it was the wind, but the sound was too vocal, too deliberate. It rose and fell like a voice, like words shaped by a throat, though no recognizable language emerged. The sound continued for nearly 2 minutes, then faded into silence so complete that I wondered if I'd imagined it. I stepped outside onto the porch, my flashlight casting a thin beam into the darkness. The night was clear, the stars brilliant above the dark masses of the mountains. No wind moved through the trees, no other sounds emerged from the forest. The lake was a dark mirror, reflecting nothing. I went back inside and locked the door. Even though it was ridiculous, a lock wouldn't stop anything larger than a human, and the next nearest help was 40 minutes away by vehicle, a distance that might as well have been 40 miles in an emergency. Over the next week, the incidents accumulated. I found another arranged animal, a mule deer this time, positioned at the edge of the North Trail meadow in the same strange, peaceful posture. More of the 3-line scratches on its flank, no other wounds, no evidence of what had killed it. On 2 separate nights I heard the voices again, sometimes one voice, sometimes what seemed like multiple voices calling back and forth across the lake. They weren't howls or cries or any animal sound I recognized. They were too complex, too layered with what seemed like intention. The more unsettling development was the behavior change in the living wildlife. The elk that normally grazed without fear began to avoid the areas near the lake. The mule deer population seemed to have shifted to the western side of my patrol area. Most striking was the behavior of the gray jays that usually filled the forest with constant chatter. They had gone silent. The entire forest seemed to be holding its breath. I documented everything meticulously, as my training demanded. Dates, times, locations, descriptions, photographs. I filed a report with the station supervisor suggesting that something was affecting the wildlife population, possibly a disease vector, or a predator species that had moved into the territory. He seemed uninterested. Rangers report these kinds of patterns all the time, he said over the radio. Seasonal variation in animal behavior. Nothing to be concerned about unless you see actual injuries to the population. But I could feel it in a way that his dismissal couldn't touch. Something was wrong in the forest around Tecoshinakapi Lake. Something was watching. Something had changed the behavior of every living creature within my territory. The 4th week of October brought heavy snow, early for the season and thick enough to close the upper mountain pass. My supply run to Kalispell would have to be delayed. I was stocked well enough. The cabin had flour, canned vegetables, dried meat, coffee, and plenty of firewood stacked against the north wall. I could survive comfortably through November if needed. The isolation, which had felt so welcoming when I arrived, began to feel different. It felt like a trap with very clean walls. On the night of October 27th, I saw the first one. I was lying in bed, reading by lamplight, when I heard the scratching at the cabin wall. It wasn't the sound of wind or branches, it was deliberate, methodical, three-line patterns being dragged slowly across the wooden planks. I froze, my hand still holding the book, listening. The scratching moved along the wall toward the window, then stopped. Silence returned, complete and suffocating. I got out of bed and approached the window, which had been closed and shuttered. I opened the shutter carefully, my heart moving in a way that made my breathing difficult. The window was intact, and outside was only darkness. I pressed my face close to the glass and tried to see anything beyond the reflection of the lamplight behind me. That's when I saw it. The face was pressed against the glass from the outside, so close to the window that if the glass hadn't been between us, we would have been breathing the same air. At first, my mind refused to process what I was seeing. The shape was roughly human, pale enough to show clearly in the darkness, with a head that seemed too large for the body below it. But the details were wrong in a way that made my stomach convulse. The eyes were too wide set, positioned almost on the sides of the skull. The mouth was open, stretched far wider than a human mouth could stretch, the opening extending nearly from ear to ear if ears were present. The thing had a neck, yes, but it seemed to twist at an angle that no human spine could achieve. And beneath the pale skin I could see muscles working, contracting, as if the face was trying to make expressions that human musculature couldn't support. I screamed. I actually screamed, the sound tearing from my throat before I could control it. I slammed the shutter closed and backed away from the window, my breathing becoming short, panicked gasps. The thing outside didn't make a sound. There were no impacts against the shutter, no attempts to force entry, no response at all. I spent the rest of the night with the lamp burning, all the shutters closed and barred, and my service pistol, which I'd never expected to use, sitting on the table in front of me. My hands shook for hours. Rational thoughts tried to assert themselves. I'd been alone for weeks. I'd been stressed. Shadows played tricks, and the mind sees what it expects to see in darkness. I'd probably seen a distorted reflection or a bear standing on its hind legs, my fear translating it into something worse. But I knew what I'd seen, and I knew that explaining it away was the first step toward dying in this cabin. In the morning, I examined the window from outside. The wooden frame showed fresh gouges, 3 parallel lines of them, scratched into the wood with enough force to penetrate the weathered surface. Whatever had been at the window was real, and it was powerful. It was patient. It had looked at me and then simply waited. The temperature dropped below freezing that night. By the next morning, ice had formed on the lake, a thin skim that would grow thicker as October became November. I did something I hadn't allowed myself to do before. I called the supervisor on the radio and requested an emergency evacuation. I said I had a medical condition that needed attention, that I didn't feel safe staying at the remote station. The response was bureaucratic and frustrating. An emergency extraction would cost the park money, would raise questions about my fitness for the position, would likely result in my reassignment. The supervisor suggested I take some personal medication if I was experiencing anxiety, make sure I was getting adequate sleep, and reassess my emotional state in a few days. Most rangers experience some degree of psychological adjustment when stationed remotely, he said in a voice that suggested he was reading from a script. The isolation can create a kind of heightened perception where normal sounds and sights seem threatening. I suggest you maintain a regular schedule, document any actual problems, and check in again next week. I didn't bother trying to convince him. What would I tell him? That something with an inhuman face had pressed itself against my window? That animals were being arranged in ritual patterns? That the entire forest seemed to be communicating something I couldn't understand? He would think I was having a mental breakdown, and maybe I was. But the scratches on the cabin wall were real. The arranged bodies of the animals were real. The sounds across the water at night were real. After that conversation, something shifted in me. I stopped waiting for help. I stopped thinking about leaving. Instead, I began to understand that I was being tested, or studied, or hunted, and I needed to survive. I reinforced the cabin's security. I used materials from the storage shed to block the windows more securely, leaving only small gaps for observation. I maintained a fire in the wood stove constantly, keeping the cabin warm and bright. I moved my sleeping area to the center of the room, away from walls and windows. I set up a perimeter of supplies around the cabin, anything that would make noise if disturbed. Every night I stayed awake until dawn, listening, watching through the observation gaps I'd created. The things, and I was certain now there was more than one, returned frequently. They came almost every night, moving around the cabin, sometimes scratching at the walls, sometimes just standing in the darkness, watching the light spill out through the gaps in my makeshift barricades. I never got a full look at any of them after that first night. They seemed to understand that they needed to stay just beyond the reach of clear observation, but I learned their patterns. They were silent, moving with an almost liquid grace through the forest. They preferred the hours between midnight and 3 a.m. They never attempted direct assault on the cabin, never tried to force their way in. It was as if they were honoring some kind of agreement about what was mine and what was theirs. The forest was theirs. This cabin was mine. And they were simply reminding me of that boundary. The sounds they made were unlike anything in nature. Sometimes they seemed to call to each other across distances, a sound like wind through a tunnel, but deliberate, shaped by intention. Sometimes they made softer sounds, almost like voices attempting human speech, the sounds distorted and wrong, as if the vocal apparatus producing them wasn't quite human. Once, I heard something that sounded like my own name, drawn out and changed by that alien throat. On November 4th, something changed. I had been awake for 36 hours. The sleep deprivation was starting to make the edges of reality seem soft and unreliable. I kept coffee constantly brewing, using the small camp stove to maintain a continuous supply. My hands trembled from the caffeine and my thoughts moved in slow circles, like I was thinking through water. The day had been clear and cold, with a wind that seemed to come straight off the Canadian border. I'd done my morning observations and documented the continued absence of the wildlife that had once populated the area. The forest felt empty, abandoned. Only the things in the darkness remained. As twilight approached, I noticed something at the lake's edge, near the dock. From the cabin's window, I could see a shape positioned at the water's margin. Another animal, arranged in the now familiar peaceful pose. This time, it was a mule deer, positioned facing the cabin, its head tilted back as if looking at the sky. I knew what this was. It was a message, an invitation. Every rational part of my mind screamed that I should ignore it. Instead, I did something that people who survive alone in the wilderness long enough eventually understand. I made a decision based on instinct rather than fear. I collected my coat and boots, removed the barricades from the cabin door, and walked out into the gathering darkness. The cold hit me immediately. The wind cut through my layers, carrying the sharp smell of pine and frozen water. My breath formed clouds in front of my face. The cabin light spilled behind me, creating a rectangle of safety that seemed impossibly small against the vast darkness pressing in from all sides. I walked to the dock. The deer lay where I'd seen it from the window, its body still warm when I knelt beside it. The cause of death was obvious now that I was close enough to see it properly. The animal's back had been broken, the spinal cord severed with terrible precision. It had been placed here recently, maybe within the last hour. The blood was still liquid, the muscles not yet fully stiffened by rigor mortis. But beyond the technical observation of how the animal had died was the broader question of why. Why place it here, at my dock, where I would be sure to find it? Why arrange it with such care, positioned where the light from my cabin would illuminate it? I heard the sound behind me. It was the closest any of them had come to me while I was conscious and aware of the approach. The sound was soft, a kind of exhalation, like breathing made audible, but deeper than any human breath. When I turned, it was standing at the edge of the forest clearing, perhaps 20 yards away. Even in the darkness, with only the distant cabin light providing illumination, I could make out its general shape. It was tall, maybe 7 feet, its body thin in a way that suggested the frame beneath the skin was wrong, the proportions distorted to something that human evolution had never designed. Its arms hung at its sides, ending in hands with too many fingers, or fingers that were too long. Its head was the most disturbing part. Large and bulbous, the features arranged in a configuration that was almost human but fundamentally wrong in ways I couldn't quite articulate. We stood there, looking at each other across the frozen ground. The wind moved through the pine trees, and I could smell something on the air. Something like old meat left out in the sun, combined with the iron smell of blood, and something else, something ancient and wrong. And then it spoke. The voice didn't come from its mouth. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, a sound that bypassed my ears and registered directly in my brain. It was nearly silent, barely audible, but the information it conveyed was clear, an image of the cabin, my cabin, the safe space I'd created. The thing was asking permission to come inside, or perhaps it was informing me that it was about to come inside, the distinction unclear. I heard my own voice responding before I'd made a conscious decision to speak. "No," I said. "This is mine. The forest is yours." The thing made a sound that might have been acknowledgement or might have been amusement. The pitch was low, a kind of resonant thrumming that I felt in my chest more than heard. It moved, not toward me but toward the deer. It picked up the carcass with a delicate gentleness that contradicted the horror of its appearance and its actions. Then it moved back into the forest, the darkness swallowing it completely. I stood on the dock for a long time after it disappeared, unable to move, unable to think clearly. The wind cut through me, but I barely felt it. I had just communicated with something that shouldn't exist, had made a treaty or an understanding that transcended language. When I finally went back inside, I didn't reinstall all the barricades. I left the shutters partially open so that I could see and be seen. That night and every night after, the things came but didn't approach the cabin. They moved around the perimeter, watching the light within. Sometimes I watched back. The forest had remapped itself. The living animals, the few that remained, stayed far from Takashinakapi Lake. The things of the darkness had made it clear that this was their territory. My cabin was an island of neutrality, a place where they allowed me to exist, perhaps because I had acknowledged their dominion, perhaps because they were curious about what I was, what drove me to remain in a place that no sane creature would stay. November became December, and the snow fell in earnest. The ice on the lake thickened, the supply road up the mountain became impassable, and my communication with the station supervisor became occasional and strained. I told him the weather was severe, that I was managing the station alone, that I would continue to file reports as conditions allowed. He seemed relieved that I wasn't requesting evacuation anymore, and he stopped asking probing questions about my mental state. I learned to live differently. By day, I maintained the routines of a ranger. I documented what little wildlife remained. I maintained the equipment. I filled out the reports that no one would read. By night, I coexisted with the darkness that had claimed the forest around me. The things never entered the cabin, but their presence became as familiar as my own breathing. I understood that they were intelligent, that they communicated in ways I could barely perceive, that they were bound by some kind of agreement they'd established with me, or that I'd established with myself through them. In late December, the supply road was cleared enough for a truck to come through. The driver, a man named Rickard who'd made the run for 5 years, arrived with supplies and unexpected conversation. He'd come from the valley below, where a family of hunters had reported strange occurrences in the forest. Animals arranged in what they described as ritual positions, sounds that weren't quite animal, and a general sense of being watched. They'd pulled out of the wilderness early, cutting their season short. Probably just overreacting, Rickard said as he offloaded supplies at the cabin. Happens sometimes with inexperienced hunters. They get spooked by normal forest sounds and see predators everywhere. I agreed with him because what else could I do? I couldn't tell him what I knew, what I'd seen, what I'd made a peace with in the darkness. It would sound like the breakdown of a man isolated too long, a ranger losing his grip on reality. After he left, the silence returned. The forest settled around me like a blanket, heavy and absolute. By January, I had stopped expecting rescue or relief. The winter was harsh, and the isolation was complete. The things moved through the forest in the darkness, and I watched them from my windows with a kind of acceptance that I didn't fully understand. They never threatened anymore. They had accepted my presence as a given, a strange anomaly in their world, a human who had learned to live among them without trespassing. I think, in the deepest part of the winter, that I had stopped being entirely human, not in any supernatural sense, but in the fundamental way that humans change when they're removed from human society long enough. I began to understand the language of the forest in ways that didn't require words. I could read the patterns of the weather in the quality of light on the snow. I could sense when the things in the darkness were moving by something other than sight or sound, by a kind of pressure change in the air itself. In February, I received a radio transmission that nearly made me laugh. A hiker from Kalispell had gone missing on a trail 40 miles south of my station. Park services were requesting that I monitor my territory and report any signs of a lost person. A missing hiker in the winter, they wouldn't survive long. The wilderness was too cold, too unforgiving, too full of things that had marked it as their own. I filed a report that I would monitor the territory, all while knowing with certainty that if that hiker had wandered into the forest where the things lived, where the darkness had taken control, then he was already beyond help. The forest would keep him or consume him, but he wouldn't leave alive. 3 days later, I found him. He was arranged at the edge of the northern trail, positioned in the same peaceful pose as all the animals they'd left before. His body was intact, mostly undamaged, though the cold had made his skin waxy and pale. His eyes were open, staring upward at the gray sky. The medical examiner later concluded that he'd died of exposure, his body simply giving out in the cold. But I knew better. The things had found him, had studied him the way they'd studied the animals, had made some kind of decision about him, and had arranged him as an offering or a warning. I filed a detailed report about the location where I'd found him. A rescue team came and collected the body. The incident was noted as a tragic accident, a hiker who'd gotten lost in bad weather and succumbed to exposure. No one asked why the body had been so carefully arranged. No one considered that something other than weather might have been responsible for the death. Spring came eventually, as spring always does. The snow melted. The animals that had fled returned cautiously to the forest. The things in the darkness seemed to withdraw deeper into the wilderness, though I could still feel their presence, still sensed them watching from the deeper parts of the forest where human feet rarely ventured. I completed my contract as the winter ranger and was offered a position for the summer season at a different location in the park. I accepted it without hesitation. It was time to leave Takoshinakapi Lake, to return to a place where humans still moved and worked and spoke to each other. But before I left, on the last night, I walked to the dock one final time. The water was dark and still, reflecting the emerging stars. I stood there for a long time, remembering the first night I saw one of them, remembering the fear that had crippled me, remembering the moment when I'd stopped seeing them as threats and started seeing them as just another aspect of the wilderness I'd chosen to inhabit. The things came one final time as I stood on the dock. They emerged from the forest in a loose group, maybe 5 or 6 of them, their pale forms visible in the darkness. We stood there, watching each other, and I felt something I couldn't quite name. Not friendship, certainly not that, but something like recognition. We had shared a territory for a season, we had made an agreement that neither would destroy the other. We had coexisted in a state that was neither peace nor war, but something older and stranger. One of them stepped forward. It was the one I'd spoken to that first night on the dock, the one I'd made the initial understanding with. It came almost to the edge of the dock, close enough that I could see the texture of its skin, the intelligence burning in its 2 wide eyes, the alien shape of its mouth moving as if forming words. I never heard what it tried to tell me. Some communication attempts don't translate across the distance between species. But I understood that it was saying goodbye, or perhaps thanking me for my consideration, for not trying to destroy it or drive it away, for simply accepting that the forest was large enough for both of us to exist. I left Takoshinakapi Lake in the morning, and I never returned. The cabin sits empty now most of the time, though I've heard from other rangers who've done seasonal work in that territory that the cabin gets occasional visitors, uninvited visitors. There are unexplained repairs that happen. Broken windows are replaced, the woodpile is restocked, by hands that are never seen. I work in safer territories now, in places where the human presence is more established, where the wilderness is more thoroughly mapped and managed and controlled. But I think about that lake sometimes, about the things that live in the darkness there, about the moment when I stopped being afraid and started simply accepting that the world is larger and stranger than the maps and the training manuals tell us. Sometimes, on winter nights, I stand outside and listen to the wind, and I think I can hear that sound again. The almost voices calling back and forth across a distance, the sounds of intelligence communicating across a gap that human language was never designed to bridge. I never told anyone what I really encountered at Takoshinakapi Lake. Who would believe me? More importantly, who would be foolish enough to try to understand what I saw, when understanding seemed to require the sacrifice of everything that made you human? The forest remembers, though. The lake remembers. And somewhere in that remote wilderness of Glacier National Park, in the deep places where the darkness never fully lifts, the things are still there, still watching, still waiting for the next human foolish enough to seek isolation in their territory. I pray they show that person the same mercy they showed me. I took the ranger position at Glacier because I needed to disappear, and Montana felt far enough away. My name is Marcus Webb, and in the autumn of 2019 I was a man running from his own name. The corporate job in Denver had consumed me. The late nights, the marriages of convenience, the way morning coffee tasted like mediocrity. My therapist used words like burnout and existential crisis. What she meant was that I'd become hollow, a shell that answered emails and attended meetings and paid taxes but didn't actually exist anymore. The Ranger Service interview happened on a Tuesday. I drove north with no real plan, thinking maybe the mountains would ask fewer questions than people do. The district manager, a weathered woman named Kess, looked at my application and raised an eyebrow. "You've got a degree in geology. You're overqualified for this position. I need to be outside," I told her. That was true, though it wasn't the whole truth. She hired me the next day. Perhaps she recognized something in my voice. the sound of a man who wasn't asking for opportunity but asylum. By October, I was stationed at the Iceman Pass research cabin, a remote 2-room structure 6 miles into the park's northwestern interior, accessible only by hiking or park service vehicle. The cabin sat on the edge of Kindla Lake, one of the park's deepest and most pristine waters. My job was simple: maintain the cabin, monitor wildlife activity, respond to lost hikers, and collect data on seasonal changes. The isolation was absolute. Cell service was non-existent. Radio contact with the main station was possible but temperamental. I chose this assignment specifically for that isolation. I wanted silence. What I got was far different. The first month was restful. I repaired roof shingles, inventoried supplies, and learned the rhythms of the forest in autumn. Kindla Lake became my anchor. I'd wake at 5 a.m. to the sound of water lapping against the dock, and I'd sit on the weathered bench with black coffee, watching light materialize across the water's surface. The coldness there was profound, not hostile, but ancient, as though the lake had been frozen and thawed so many times that it held something essential about the mountain's age. The mountains surrounding the lake were steep, and the forest floor was thick with deadfall. In places, the trees were so dense that the light never quite reached the ground. You could stand in those shadows at noon and feel like twilight had arrived years before it actually would. By late October, the weather was turning. Snow had begun appearing at higher elevations, and the day-to-night temperature swings were dramatic. I noticed the animals had become more aggressive about food storage, more numerous, more desperate. Bears were still active, moving with the concentrated intensity of creatures trying to pack calories before hibernation. I saw wolf tracks several times, heading toward the lake. That was normal. What wasn't normal started small. Too small to report, almost. Small enough that I questioned whether I was actually seeing it or constructing it from loneliness and silence. The hikers came on a Friday in early November. There were 4 of them. 2 couples from Seattle, their permit filed properly, their itinerary mapped. They were doing a 3-day loop through the park's interior, and the Iceman Pass area was the second waypoint on their journey. I had been notified of their arrival and had checked on them their first morning. They seemed fine. Young, enthusiastic, well-equipped. The kind of people who had done this before. Their camp was a mile north of my cabin, in a cleared area near the lake's northern shore. I'd hiked up to check on them around 8 a.m., as protocol required. They were making breakfast, and one of the men, Vincent, invited me to have coffee. I declined politely and headed back. That was October 31st. On November 1st, I didn't see them hiking down past my cabin as planned. At 11 a.m., when they should have passed the checkpoint I maintained, I started the hike up to their camp. I found their supplies exactly where they'd left them. 2 tents, fully set up. Backpacks organized neatly. Food hung properly in a bare cache. What I didn't find was any sign of the hikers themselves. I called it in on the park radio. Station said they'd send search and rescue to my position, ETA 2 hours. Meantime, I was to assess the situation and ensure the camp was secure. Standard procedure. Nothing unusual about hikers moving outside their planned route or losing track of time. But something felt wrong. The coffee pot was still sitting on their camping stove, half full, cold. There were no footprints leading away from the camp into the forest. But that made sense. The ground was hard-packed. What caught my attention was the size of their camps. 4 people, 2 tents. But there were marks in the dirt, scuff patterns, as though something had circled the camp multiple times. Could have been them walking around checking things. Animals do that too, though. I walked the perimeter. Nothing. No blood, no torn equipment, no sign of emergency, just absence. The forest around the camp was quiet, in a way that felt deliberate. The normal ambient sounds of the woods, birds, wind in branches, small animals moving through undergrowth, seemed dampened. The absence of sound was almost louder than sound itself. By the time Sayar arrived, evening was falling. We spent 4 hours searching the surrounding area, calling names into the darkening forest. Nothing. No response, no signs, no bodies. The lead SAR officer, a serious man named Garrett, organized a full search pattern to begin at first light. I didn't sleep that night. I sat on my cabin porch with coffee and a flashlight, listening to the lake, thinking about 4 people who had walked into the woods and vanished. The kind of thing that happened occasionally in wilderness areas. People fell, people got disoriented. The mountains were patient and indifferent. But something about this felt different. On November 2nd by noon, the search team still hadn't found them. The dogs had come, German shepherds and bloodhounds trained for exactly this situation. What the dogs did was strange. They'd pick up a scent, follow it maybe 100 yards, and then stop. They'd circle back, agitated, refusing to go further. The handlers had never seen them behave that way before. By November 3rd, the search was scaled back. Winter was coming, and resources were limited. The assumption, stated carefully in official reports, was that the hikers had suffered a catastrophic accident. A fall from one of the cliff faces that surrounded the area, a collapse into one of the old mining caves that dotted the mountains. Something sudden and fatal that hadn't left recoverable remains. People died in mountains. The mountains took them back. The search wound down over the next week. By November 10th, it was officially called off. I was alone again at Iceman Pass, but something had changed. The forest felt different now. The silence had texture, and I had begun to notice things that I couldn't easily explain. The first clear sign appeared during the second week of November, when the snow had accumulated enough to show tracks. I was making my morning rounds around the cabin when I noticed something in the snow near the dock. Prints. Large ones, longer than any mountain lion track, wider than a grizzly's hind foot. They moved in a pattern that suggested bipedal walking, but the stride was unusual, longer than human, with asymmetrical pressure points that suggested the creature was using its arms for balance or locomotion as well. I followed them. They came from the forest to the east, approached the dock from behind the boathouse, and then circled the cabin twice before heading back into the woods. The pattern repeated nightly. By November 20th, I was documenting the tracks. I photographed them, measured them, noted the depth of the impression. The tracks were too large and shaped too differently to be bear. Not mountain lion, not human. The only large bipedal creature that fit even remotely was Ursus arctos, the grizzly, but their hind footprints, while they could superficially resemble human tracks, didn't have this particular geometry. I contacted the main station and described what I was seeing. There was a long pause on the other end of the radio. "We'll send someone out to collect physical evidence," Kess said finally. "But Marcus, be careful. If something's injured or starving, it's going to be dangerous." That was the assumption. An injured animal. An anomaly. Something with a rational explanation. But the tracks had intelligence behind them. I could see it in the pattern. The creature wasn't randomly investigating. It was studying the cabin, testing it. The same circling pattern, the same careful approach to the edges of the structure, the same deliberate route each night. The worst part was the sounds. By late November, the temperatures had dropped below zero. The lake began to freeze, the water creating new music, cracks and booms and the strange metallic groans of expanding ice. In that soundscape, other sounds began to emerge. Calling sounds, not quite vocal, more like a combination of throat sounds and wind through structures. Patterns that almost suggested communication but never quite resolved into anything recognizable as language. The sounds came from the forest surrounding the cabin, moving in patterns that suggested multiple sources, multiple creatures working in coordination. I would lie awake listening to these sounds, trying to map their movement, trying to understand what they were. The rational part of my brain suggested animals, wolves probably, their vocalizations distorted by the cold air and my own anxiety. But the sounds had a quality that disturbed something deeper in my psychology. They weren't quite right. Something in their pattern and tone suggested intentionality in a way that wolf calls didn't. By early December, I was documenting everything. I maintained a journal with recordings on my digital recorder, sketches of the tracks, notes on behavior patterns. The cabin had become a small observatory, and I had become obsessed with cataloging whatever was surrounding it. I should have requested transfer. I should have called the main station and reported that the isolation was becoming psychologically unsustainable. That would have been the rational move. Instead, I deepened my observation. I installed motion sensor lights around the cabin. I reinforced the doors and windows. I began keeping a rifle loaded and ready. Not to hunt, to protect. The event that broke my remaining composure happened on December 14th. I had been hiking to a supply cache 3 miles north, where we maintained equipment and emergency supplies in a locked storage container. The hike was routine, a path I'd walked dozens of times. The snow was roughly a foot deep, temperatures around 15 degrees Fahrenheit. I found the hiking boot halfway between the cabin and the cache. It was a fairly new North Face boot, the kind the Seattle hikers would have been wearing. The boot was still laced tightly, the foot still inside it. The foot, not a corpse, not a body. Just a foot, severed cleanly at the ankle, still inside the boot. I didn't touch it. I just stood there staring at it, trying to process what I was seeing. The foot was mummified, partially. The cold had preserved it. The skin had begun to desiccate, but it was recent enough that I could still see the individual hairs on the calf, the callus patterns on the sole. This was Vincent's boot. I was certain of it. I remembered the logo on the tongue. My hands were shaking as I radioed the cabin. Then I requested an immediate Park Service vehicle, a real investigative team, and medical examiner support. I marked the location with flagging tape and waited, standing perhaps 20 feet from the boot, unwilling to get closer, unwilling to look away. What I understood in those few hours of waiting was that the hikers weren't dead from a fall. Something had done this. Something had taken them and was now, for reasons I couldn't fathom, displaying its work. The boot was a message, a statement, a warning. When the SAR team arrived, they found more. Within a radius of roughly 500 meters from the boot discovery, we located 3 more pieces. A hand, still wearing the watch of one of the female hikers, a section of spine, the vertebrae scattered but arranged in an almost pattern-like way on the snow. Remains of clothing. The animals were torn apart, the investigators told me, with wounds consistent with predation, but the pattern was unusual. The way the remains were distributed, the specific nature of the damage, it suggested multiple attackers working with coordination and purpose. It was, one of the forensic analysts said, as though the hikers had been systematically dismantled over time, rather than killed suddenly. The investigation focused, inevitably, on the theory that they'd been killed by wildlife. A coordinated pack attack, possibly. Wolves, though wolves didn't typically attack humans. The evidence didn't fit, but it was the only explanation that fit the park's operational framework. By December 20th, the investigation was effectively concluded. Wildlife was the culprit. Tragic accident. The remains would be returned to families. The case would be closed. I was asked to remain at the cabin to continue monitoring the area, which meant I would be alone with whatever had done this. Winter took on a nightmare quality. By January, the temperature regularly dropped to 20 below zero. The cabin became a bunker. I sealed every gap, reinforced every window, kept the rifle loaded at all times. I was sleeping maybe 3 hours a night, the rest of the time listening to the sounds from the forest. The creatures had become bolder. The footprints were now appearing on the cabin roof. I'd wake to the sound of impact, the sound of movement across the shingles. I'd grab the rifle and rush outside, only to see tracks in the snow that confirmed something massive had been directly above my sleeping area. The tracks showed incredible grip and balance, something with significant upper body strength, capable of pulling itself onto a sloped roof. The calling had evolved too. It had moved beyond random vocalizations into something that almost resembled patterns. Repeating sequences that I tried to decode, phrases that seemed to have structure even though they contained no human vowels or consonants. I found myself analyzing the recordings obsessively, looking for linguistic patterns, trying to convince myself that this was animal communication I simply didn't understand rather than something else entirely. The worst part was the hunting. In mid-January, I was collecting firewood when I discovered the kill. A young elk, maybe a year old, had been taken and partially consumed, but the manner of consumption was wrong. The ribs had been torn from the spine and arranged in rows. The organs had been removed but then positioned in a geometric pattern on the snow. The head had been separated and placed atop a fallen log, the eyes facing toward my cabin. This wasn't predation. This was arrangement. Intention. I documented it. I reported it. The Park Service suggested it was predator behavior. Wolves kill and eat. Sometimes they arrange kills in certain ways. It all made rational sense, except it didn't. I'd studied wildlife. I knew predator behavior. This was something else. By February, I'd stopped sleeping in the cabin bedroom. I'd moved into the main room and installed a cot in the corner with the best line of sight to all entrances. I kept the rifle within arm's reach. I was eating but not tasting the food. I was running automated systems and maintaining the log, but my actual daily behavior had narrowed to observation and defense. I was beginning to understand what was happening. Not intellectually, I couldn't form coherent thoughts anymore, but some deeper part of my mind had grasped the pattern. This wasn't about food. The creatures weren't hungry in any conventional sense. They were hunting me specifically. The remains of the hikers, the displays, the nightly circling, the sounds that seemed designed to prevent sleep. This was targeting behavior. This was predation on a psychological level. They were studying me the way I was studying them. This realization came with a kind of clarity that felt like insanity. I couldn't explain it to anyone. I couldn't report it. What would I say? That the creatures surrounding my cabin were engaged in a psychological campaign against me? That seemed impossible, yet the evidence was undeniable. By mid-February, I had been alone at the cabin for 3 months. I was experiencing auditory hallucinations, things that I knew weren't real but heard clearly. Voices calling my name from the forest, whispers against the cabin walls, sounds of things moving through the interior when I knew, absolutely, that I had secured every entry point. I was losing it, the isolation, the stress, the impossible situation. My mind was fragmenting, except on February 18th, I discovered fresh blood on the exterior of my cabin door. Not old blood, not an animal's. Fresh enough to still be slightly tacky, and the amount was significant. Something large and wounded had been at my door. I opened the door and looked down. The trail of blood led into the forest, but not far. About 50 yards from my cabin, I found the source. A mountain lion, young and in perfect health, was lying dead in the snow. Its neck was broken. The break was deliberate, not crushing but a precise snapping that suggested extraordinary strength applied with knowledge. This was a message. Something had killed one of the region's apex predators and left it at my doorstep. A message that said, we can kill anything, including what should kill you. By late February, I'd stopped trying to maintain pretense of normalcy. My journals had become increasingly incoherent. My radio communications with the main station were reduced to weekly check-ins where I reported no problems in a voice that I could hear sounding more hollow each time. The Park Service couldn't bring out a full supply run until March. I was rationing food carefully, mixing paranoia with genuine concern. When I did the math, I might be short by April if the weather continued to prevent deliveries. This created a situation where I had to leave the cabin. Hunting was forbidden in the park, but I could trap. I set snares in the forest, moving out from the cabin in larger and larger circles, always returning before dark. The forest was different now. The density had increased somehow. The trees seemed closer together, though I knew that was impossible. The light was never quite sufficient to feel safe, even at midday. On March 3rd, I was checking a snare line 3 miles north of the cabin when I encountered the first direct contact. I heard movement ahead on the trail. Large movement. I raised the rifle and advanced carefully. What I found was a shape, roughly humanoid but too tall to be human, moving through the dense forest with remarkable speed and grace. It moved in a manner that was almost liquid, joints bending at angles that suggested unusual flexibility. It saw me. I saw it. The moment stretched, then it was gone. I fired twice, the shots splitting the forest open, the reports echoing back from the mountainsides. I advanced to where I'd last seen it. Nothing. No blood, no tracks, no sign that anything had actually been there. Except I had seen it. I was certain I had. And the moment had lasted long enough for me to register certain details. No clear facial features, hair or something like hair, but the texture was wrong. Skin that appeared pale but moved in ways that suggested something beneath the surface rippling. And the smell, that moment had brought a smell, chemical and complex, like rotting meat and something fungal and something electric all at once. I ran back to the cabin. I locked myself in. And I waited for whatever would come. What came was different than the nightly visiting. Around 10 p.m. I heard the first vocal attempt. It started as that familiar pattern of non-language sounds, but then, impossibly, it shifted into something approximating my name. My name, spoken in a voice that was almost human but wrong in every micro-inflection, drawn out longer than a human could sustain, repeated over and over. Marcus, Marcus, Marcus. Not just outside, coming from multiple directions. They were coordinating. They were trying to get me to leave the cabin. I didn't go. By 2 a.m., the sounds had stopped. The silence was worse than the sounds. I sat in the dark with the rifle and tried to think. The hikers. The ones who had vanished. They had tried to leave. They had tried to run or escape, and it had resulted in systematic dismemberment. They'd ended up as pieces arranged on snow, as a message left for the park rangers to find. What would happen to me if I tried the same? But I couldn't stay in the cabin forever. That was psychological warfare 101, containment. They were trying to corner me in a space where I'd eventually panic and run, or stay until starvation finished what they'd started. By March 10th, I had to make a decision. I decided to hike out, directly. Due south toward the main road, avoiding the usual routes, moving fast and with purpose. If I could reach the highway before nightfall, I could get to the ranger station and actual help. I packed a small bag, water, emergency rations, the rifle, ammunition. I left a note for whoever might find the cabin. I didn't explain anything, because I didn't have anything coherent to explain. I left at 5 a.m., in false dawn, before full light. The forest was different than I remembered. The trees seemed closer, the paths were harder to navigate. Several times I found myself in thick brush that I was certain hadn't been there before. I was moving too fast, breathing hard, aware that I was generating noise and not caring. It was midday when I realized I was being herded. The realization came suddenly. I'd been following what I thought was a natural path, but in hindsight, it curved in patterns that seemed designed to move me in a specific direction. Several times I'd thought about adjusting course, but each time I'd convinced myself that the way I was going was correct. 30 seconds of actually thinking about my route made it clear I was being directed. Directed toward what? That's when I smelled the location, or felt it. Some combination of sensory input that hit me with the force of a physical blow. The smell was overwhelming. Death and decay and something else. Something that spoke to animal survival instincts that ran deeper than conscious thought. That smell meant predator, meant danger, meant I was walking into a place where something apex and hungry was waiting. I stopped. I checked the rifle. I tried to think clearly. The forest around me had gone completely silent. No birds, no sound of wind, no animal noise, just dead air and that overwhelming smell. Then I heard them. All around me. The sounds they made, that almost language that I'd been listening to for months, but now directed at me all at once from multiple positions. Surrounding, I fired twice at the nearest sound. The rifle bucked, and the report echoed and echoed. Then immediate response, movement, sounds, something massive moving to my left. I ran faster than I'd ever run in my life, abandoning any pretense of route planning, just moving downslope, putting distance between myself and the sounds. The forest was a blur. Branches cut my face. I fell twice and scrambled back to my feet. Behind me, the sounds were organized. They were chasing. They were coordinated. And then I fell into the lake. It wasn't a graceful fall. I went over a bank I didn't see, tumbled down a slope, and plunged into the freezing water of Kintla Lake. The shock of the cold was immediate and total. Every nerve screamed. My lungs tried to inhale and filled with water. I went under, disoriented. Unsure which way was surface. The rifle was gone. My bag was gone. I was drowning in black water in March when the ice hadn't completely melted. But panic has its own logic. I thrashed upward, found surface, gasped for air. The shore was 15 feet away. The water temperature was approximately 40 degrees. I had maybe 5 minutes before hypothermia took over. Maybe. I swam. The movements were clumsy, desperate. The shore seemed impossibly far. Behind me, the sounds had stopped. The creatures had stopped chasing. I didn't understand why until I pulled myself onto the rocky shore and turned to look back. They were watching me from the forest edge. 3 of them standing upright, their shapes barely distinguishable from the deep shadows of the forest. Not attacking, waiting, watching as I crawled up the slope, shaking violently from cold, unable to move effectively. I crawled toward the cabin, which was maybe half a mile away. My body was shutting down. Hypothermia was a slow process, a stealing of consciousness, a gradual reduction of the world until nothing mattered but reaching warmth. I made it to the cabin somehow. I don't remember the actual process of arrival. My next clear memory was stripping off soaked clothes and standing in front of the cabin's small stove, every muscle shaking uncontrollably. By evening I had stabilized enough to think. My radio had remained in the cabin. I sent a distress signal. Full emergency protocol. People, help. A situation that had moved beyond park operations. The response came quickly. There would be a helicopter the next morning, weather permitting. I should stay in the cabin and await pickup. I agreed that something had broken in me during those minutes in the lake. Some final barrier between what I was experiencing and what I was willing to accept. That night, I sat on my cot and truly considered what had happened over the past 4 months. The hikers had disappeared. I'd found parts of them arranged deliberately. I'd been surrounded by creatures that demonstrated intelligence, coordination, and what appeared to be tactical awareness. I'd been hunted, studied, pushed to the edge of a frozen lake in the middle of winter, and just when they could have finished it, they had stopped. That was the pattern I'd missed. They weren't trying to kill me. They were trying to break me. And the stopping, the watching, the final image of them standing at the forest edge, that was a demonstration that they could have killed me but chose not to. Why? The answer came to me with absolute clarity. They were waiting for something. Some threshold. Some moment when I would be weakened enough, desperate enough, or broken enough to accept what they were offering. That's when I understood what the hunger meant. In the old stories, the ones from the indigenous peoples who had lived in these mountains long before the park existed, The Kintla were creatures that weren't satisfied with predation. They were described in various ways, as spirits that had crossed some boundary, as humans who had transgressed and been changed, as creatures that existed in the spaces between human and animal. The consistent element was the hunger, not for food, for integration, for union. They were trying to turn me into one of them. The realization was cold and absolute. This was the end game, the destruction of the hikers, the demonstration of power, the psychological breakdown. It was all leading toward an offer. Stay in these mountains, join them, become part of something that existed on a level that normal existence couldn't comprehend. And the most horrifying part was that it was working. By the time I heard the helicopter approaching the next morning, I was genuinely uncertain whether I wanted to be rescued. I stood outside the cabin waving at the aircraft, signaling that I was present and ready for extraction. The helicopter descended toward the clearing beside the lake. The wind from the rotors pushed against me, grounding me in the moment. The crew descended, 2 of them moving with military precision. They were saying things to me, asking if I was injured, if I needed assistance. I heard their words but couldn't quite process them. My attention was on the forest edge. The creatures were watching. I could see them, just barely visible at the tree line, their shapes only distinguishable because I knew they were there. Standing, watching, not attacking, not attempting anything, just present. The crew was loading me into the helicopter. I climbed aboard with their assistance. As the aircraft rose, I looked down at the cabin, at the lake, at the forest where I'd spent 4 months being slowly unmade. The creatures were still visible as we climbed, their forms growing smaller but remaining distinct. I watched them until we passed above the tree line. I never looked back. The debriefing happened at the park headquarters. I told them what I could coherently explain. Missing hikers, likely predation, unusual animal behavior. I mentioned the wildlife encounters but downplayed the intensity. I said nothing about the intelligence behind the predation, nothing about the psychological campaign, nothing about the moment by the lake when they chose not to kill me. The investigators found the cabin's journal. They read my increasingly incoherent entries and arrived at a diagnosis: severe isolation-related psychosis combined with trauma from discovering remains of the missing hikers. I had experienced a complete break with reality, they said. Hallucinations, delusions of predation, paranoia, all consistent with extended isolation in extreme conditions. The recommendation was psychological evaluation and eventual return to normal duties if I was deemed fit. I was evaluated. I was deemed fit, with caveats and restrictions. I was transferred to a ranger position in the Canadian Rockies, far from Glacier, where I've been for the past 4 years. But I know what happened. The official narrative is a convenient fiction that allows the Park Service to function without acknowledging the impossible. But I know, and I know why I'm writing this now. 3 weeks ago, I was hiking a routine trail in the new park. The forest there is different, less dense, more open, more normal. But in that moment of the day when the light was fading and the shadow became thick, I saw one of them. Just a glimpse, at the edge of my vision, watching from beyond a distant tree line. They haven't forgotten me. I don't know what they want now. If they're still trying to complete whatever transformation they were attempting, if I've become something different as a result of those months at Iceman Pass, something that they can track and find. What I do know is that I dream about Kintla Lake, about standing at the shore and simply walking into the water, about not resisting, about understanding what integration would mean. And each morning, I wake uncertain whether that impulse is coming from me or from something else. This account will probably be dismissed like my ranger journals were dismissed as the narrative of a broken man trying to construct meaning from a traumatic experience. That's fine. I'm not writing this to be believed. I'm writing it as evidence of my knowledge. When it happens again, and it will happen again, someone will find this account. Someone will understand that the disappearances and the remains and the impossible animal behavior are not products of psychosis. They are intentional, they are patient, and they are still very much waiting. The forest doesn't let go of the people it takes. I'm proof of that. I'm still here, walking around, maintaining routines, pretending that the mountains have released me, but I can feel the pull. Some nights I feel it strongly enough that I have to physically restrain myself from leaving the settlement and walking back into the wilderness. The creatures at Iceman Pass are still hunting. They're just hunting a different kind of prey now. One that's learning to understand what they want. One that's beginning to hunger the way they do. My name is Cade Brennan, I'm writing this because someone needs to know what happened out here, and because I need to convince myself it actually occurred. I accepted the position as remote ranger for Glacier National Park's northwestern sector during the worst 6 months of my life. I'd been working as a seasonal ranger at Yellowstone for 3 years, competent enough at the job, but hollow. My wife had left me 2 years prior, citing my obsession with disappearing into wilderness as often as possible. She wasn't wrong. After our separation, I buried myself in longer patrols, more backcountry assignments, anything to avoid the apartment in Bozeman where her absence accumulated like dust. By late winter, my supervisor suggested I apply for the remote position at Kootenai Lake, a place so isolated that the nearest town was 40 minutes away by truck, and that was before winter shut down the mountain roads. The cabin sat on the eastern shore of Kootenai Lake, about 7 miles north of the main park entrance. It was built in 1967 by the NPS, constructed from hewn logs that had weathered to a silvery gray. The structure was built to last through anything: 2 bedrooms, a kitchen with a wood stove, a main room with windows facing the lake, propane heater in the back, a radio for emergencies only, the kind that crackled with static more than actual communication. The isolation wasn't a bug to me, it was the entire point. The lake itself was stunning in a way that made you understand why early explorers went mad trying to map this country. Pristine water, green-black under clouded skies, surrounded by mountains that seemed to lean inward as if the landscape itself was listening. The nearest human settlement was Polebridge, population around 200. Beyond that was Canada. In every other direction was national forest, wilderness, and roughly nothing for 100 miles that qualified as civilization. My job was straightforward: patrol the sector twice weekly, monitor wildlife, respond to any emergencies, report unusual activity. The position was designed for one person because this wasn't a popular area. The trails were brutal, the weather unforgiving, and the lake access was restricted except to backcountry permits. Most tourists stuck to going to the Sun Road or the Valley Trails. People like me were supposed to prevent problems in places where problems were meant to be left alone. I arrived in late March when the snow was still deep but beginning its spring collapse. The cabin had been sealed since October, and the smell when I opened the door was old and thick. I spent the first week cleaning, inventorying supplies, running the generator to test systems. The previous ranger, a man named Douglas who'd held the position for 12 years, had left it in solid condition. He'd retired and moved to Arizona. I found a note on the kitchen table: "Good luck, don't spend too much time looking at the lake at night." I assumed it was a joke about seasonal affective disorder or the psychological strain of isolation. Later I understood it differently. The first week passed without incident. The trails were barely passable, so I focused on preparing equipment and reviewing incident reports from the previous year. Nothing unusual: some bear activity in late summer, standard stuff, 2 lost hikers found within 6 hours, a brush fire in July that was managed and contained. The file marked my sector as quiet, predictable, and low risk. The second week I took my first extended patrol. The snow was thick enough that I needed snowshoes, and the cold was the kind that makes your lungs burn. I followed the North Fork Trail, checking for downed trees, snow damage, any obvious hazards. The forest was cathedral-like and completely silent. No birds, no wind, just the sound of my own breathing and the creak of snowshoes on compressed snow. About 3 miles in, I noticed something odd. The trees on both sides of the trail had been stripped of bark in vertical gouges, the wood underneath exposed and weathering to a dull brown. Not fresh damage. This was old, maybe months old, but extensive. Elk sometimes do this, but this pattern was different. The gouges were too regular, too deliberate, and they were scattered across trees of different sizes and types in a way that didn't match known elk behavior. I documented it in my patrol log, took photos, and continued. The trail looped back toward the lake, and as I emerged from the forest onto the western shore, I saw movement, a figure, bipedal and tall, moving through the shallows about 200 yards to the north. I raised my binoculars immediately, ranger instinct kicking in. Lost person, I thought. Excellent, I can handle this. The figure turned toward the mountains and continued moving with an odd, fluid gait. Even from that distance, something about the movement seemed wrong. Not human exactly, but not quite animal either. The proportions were off in a way I couldn't articulate. I called out. The sound swallowed by open water and distance. The figure didn't stop. It reached the shore, and I watched it move up the beach and into the tree line with that same unsettling locomotion. I marked the location on my map, finished the patrol, and returned to the cabin as afternoon light began its rapid collapse. I radioed in the sighting, describing a possible elk in deep water, a possible wildlife hazard. The response from district headquarters was a brief acknowledgement. Check again if you see signs of aggressive behavior. I didn't see signs of anything for another week. The silence in the cabin at night is absolute. Even with the propane heater running, the sound insulation of old logs and the remoteness of the location create a quiet so complete it seems to have weight. I'd sleep poorly, waking to noises I couldn't identify, probably normal wood settling and wind that I'd forgotten how to filter out. On my third night back from patrol, I woke to what sounded like footsteps on the wooden porch outside the bedroom window. I grabbed the flashlight I keep on my nightstand, not the service pistol. The gun seemed excessive and wrong for this kind of situation. I shone the light out the window, nothing on the porch. I went to the living room and checked all the windows. The lake was visible in the moonlight, vast and still. Snow covered everything in a uniform pale layer. There were no tracks visible on the porch when I opened the door and looked. I told myself it was an animal. A moose, maybe, drawn by the smell of human habitation. Moose are common at this elevation, and they're exactly the size and weight that would sound like slow, deliberate footsteps on wood. I went back to bed and lay awake until dawn. April brought warmer days and the beginning of the snow's serious decline. The lake ice retreated from the edges, creating pools of meltwater that glinted like broken mirrors. The trails became more passable, and I established a regular patrol schedule. Mondays and Thursdays, I'd take the North Fork Trail or the Eastern Loop. I was thorough, meticulous, the kind of ranger who actually cared about the state of the backcountry. The stripped bark appeared in more locations. Over the course of 2 weeks, I documented 7 different sites along the main trails, each showing the same vertical gouging pattern. I submitted a wildlife report, suggesting possible elk conflict requiring management. The response was a form response about monitoring and reporting. Nothing urgent. Then I found the deer. It was on my patrol of April 14th, a Wednesday, maybe a mile off the main trail where I'd spotted some anomalous tracks. The carcass was fresh, probably killed within the last 48 hours. The kill pattern was strange. The body hadn't been scavenged much, which meant something had killed it very recently or something was keeping other predators away. The damage pattern was also odd. The throat showed massive trauma, but not from the typical predator bite. The flesh was torn in a way that suggested something with hands, with fingers and nails, had done the killing. I've seen bear predation. I've seen wolf kills. I've seen the aftermath of mountain lion attacks. This didn't match any of those patterns. The wound was too precise in some ways and too brutal in others. I documented it carefully, took photos and radioed it in. The response was perfunctory. Wildlife, they said. Mountain lions coming down from higher elevations. But I knew what I'd seen, and the pattern was becoming impossible to ignore. The footsteps on the porch became regular. Not every night, maybe 3 or 4 times a week. I'd wake to the sound of something moving on the wooden planks outside the cabin. Each time, I'd get up, shine the light, and see nothing. The pattern was maddening because it was consistent without being predictable. I couldn't anticipate which night it would happen. I'd go to bed with my flashlight and wait. Around April 20th, the snowpack had melted enough that I could see the ground clearly. After hearing footsteps that night, I made coffee at dawn and went outside immediately, before anything could disturb the scene. The porch was covered with prints, human-shaped prints. Not quite human, though. The stride was too long, the foot too wide. And they circled the cabin, not just the porch but around the foundation, under the windows, as if something had been examining the structure methodically. I photographed everything, my hands shaking enough that some of the images were blurred. I called district headquarters with more urgency this time. Possible trespasser, I said. Prints consistent with human activity but unusual configuration. I need to file an incident report. The response from my supervisor, a man named Rivers, who I'd spoken to maybe 5 times, was slow and careful. We can send someone out to investigate. But that wouldn't be until Friday at the earliest. Be careful, Cade. Lock the doors. I'd been locking the doors, every night. The cabin has a main entrance with a bolt lock and a deadbolt. There's a back entrance to the storage area that also locks. All the windows have functional locks. I'd checked them during the day. That night, I checked them again before dark. Every single one was secure. I slept with the service pistol beside me. The next morning, I found the kitchen window unlatched. Not broken, just unlatched. The mechanism that holds older windows was positioned in the open position, as if someone had carefully worked it from outside. I knew I'd checked it. I was certain I'd checked it. But there it was, unlocked. The window itself still closed but accessible. I photographed it, called it in, and spent the rest of the day in a state of coiled tension. I researched on my laptop using the satellite internet connection that was technically for emergencies only. Skinwalkers, that's what came up when I started searching. Native American folklore, specifically from Navajo and other southwestern traditions, about entities that wore animal skins or took animal form. But the details were fuzzy, internet folklore mixed with pop culture horror, nothing that matched what I was experiencing. I also researched unusual predators, primates in North America, Bigfoot sightings in Montana. I found dozens of stories, most were dismissed or explained, a few remained stubbornly unexplained. The Blackfoot Glacier area had several sightings over the years. The Mission Mountains had a well-documented encounter in 1974, nothing definitive, nothing that resolved anything but enough to make me feel less insane. That night I heard something different. Not footsteps on the porch, something larger, moving through the forest behind the cabin. I could hear trees being disturbed, branches breaking. Whatever it was big and it wasn't being quiet. I grabbed the flashlight and went to the back room. When I opened the curtains and looked out, I saw it. The shape was bipedal and approximately 7 feet tall, silhouetted against the moonlit forest. The proportions were wrong, the arms too long, the shoulders too broad. And the head didn't move right. It turned toward the cabin with a fluidity that made my stomach drop, and I could swear I felt it seeing me, felt the weight of attention moving across the cabin like a physical thing. I stepped back from the window and forced myself to move slowly, no sudden movements. This was still possibly an animal, this was still possibly explicable, but my hands were shaking as I holstered my flashlight and gripped the pistol with both hands. The sound of movement continued around the cabin, circling again just like the prince had suggested. But this time, I heard it actively testing the cabin. I heard the back door being pulled on. I heard something trying the window latches. This wasn't exploration, this was evaluation. This was something trying to understand how to gain entry. I sat in the main room with the lights on and the pistol across my knees, listening to my own heartbeat sound loud enough to mask other sounds. I waited for dawn. The next morning, the damage was obvious. All the window latches had been tested. The pressure was visible in small scratches and marks around each latch. The back door frame had been examined, the bolts stressed. There were new tracks in the soft ground around the cabin, and they were unmistakably shaped like human hands. Friday arrived with clouds and the promise of rain. The district ranger showed up around noon, a man named Victor who was probably in his late 50s and had the demeanor of someone who'd responded to too many false alarms. He examined the footprints, the latch marks, the window damage. He walked the perimeter of the cabin and nodded occasionally. His conclusion was professional and dismissive. Probably a trespasser, he said. Possibly a drifter. We've had a few of those over the years who camp illegally and avoid contact. The tracks could be anyone. The latch marks could be from testing old windows. He recommended I install some better lighting around the cabin and consider setting up motion-activated cameras if I felt uncomfortable. I wanted to argue, but I could see how it all looked to him. A new ranger, isolated, interpreting normal sounds as threats, jumping to supernatural conclusions. He left me with a contact list and a promise to include the cabin in regular patrol routes, though he made it clear that my sector was low priority. That night, the rain came hard. The sound was loud on the metal roof, and I slept better than I had in a week. Sunday morning, I woke to a clear day and an urgent radio call. Lost hiker, missing since Friday evening. Female, age 34, last pinged her emergency beacon from the North Fork Trail about 6 miles northeast of my position. She'd been hiking solo, which was already a violation of the permit conditions. Weather had turned bad, visibility dropped. She was likely sheltering somewhere. I was the primary responder. I gathered my gear, loaded extra supplies, and hit the trail within 30 minutes. The rain had transformed the path into a muddy river in places, and the forest smelled clean and dangerous. I moved quickly but carefully, shouting periodic intervals, watching for signs. I found her around mile 4. In a small rock shelter maybe a quarter mile off the main trail. She was lucid, hypothermic, wearing a day pack and running gear that was completely inappropriate for backcountry travel. Her name was Rebecca Cass. She'd gotten lost the previous afternoon, found the shelter by accident, and was too afraid to continue moving in the bad weather. I gave her dry clothes from my pack, got some warm food and water into her, and began the process of radioing her location and calling for extraction. The nearest helicopter was 2 hours away. We'd have to hike out or shelter in place. I was examining her condition when I noticed her staring past me into the forest with an expression of pure focused fear. Her pupils were dilated, and she wasn't blinking. "What's wrong?" I asked. She took a long time answering. When she did, her voice was steadier than I would have expected. "There's something in the woods. I've heard it since yesterday. It sounds like a person, but it's not. It moves like, I don't know how to explain it. Like something that's learned to walk upright but hasn't quite figured it out." I followed her gaze into the trees. I didn't see anything, but the feeling of being observed suddenly intensified. I kept my voice level. "Probably just wildlife. Sound carries strange in canyons. We need to get you walking soon." She grabbed my arm. "You hear it too. I can see it in your face." I didn't deny it. I helped her up, and we began moving back toward the main trail. The rain had stopped, but water still dripped from every surface. The forest smelled heavy, full of something rotting just beyond perception. About half a mile into our return hike, I heard something follow us off the trail. Not loud, just the sound of something moving through the forest, keeping parallel to our path. Rebecca heard it too. She stopped walking and grabbed my hand. "Keep moving," I said. "Don't stop." But something wasn't right about the distance. Whatever was following us was moving faster than we were, and the spacing between sounds was decreasing. I pulled Rebecca behind a large fallen tree and drew the pistol. The shape appeared through the trees maybe 50 yards away. Bipedal, tall, moving with that same wrong gait I'd seen from the cabin. But this time there was more detail. The coloring was inconsistent, patchy. The posture was wrong in a way that suggested joints in places where human joints shouldn't be. Rebecca made a sound that wasn't quite a word. The thing stopped moving, its head turned toward us, and even from that distance, I could feel the weight of its attention. I raised the pistol with both hands. "We need to move," I said. Now, we ran. The forest tried to stop us. Branches caught at our clothes and skin. Rebecca was moving on pure adrenaline, and I was moving on the conviction that I understood what was happening, even if my rational mind was rejecting every implication. We didn't stop until we reached the main trail, and when we did, the sounds of pursuit had stopped. I radioed in a new situation report. Possible dangerous wildlife in the area. Recommending helicopter extraction to nearest medical facility for hiker. The response was tense. "Confirmation of threat level, visual contact with large unknown primate," I said. "Aggressive posture, recommend extreme caution." There was silence on the other end. Then, "Understood. Helicopter ETA 40 minutes. Rebecca and I sat in a clearing, and I kept the pistol in my hand. She was hyperventilating, and I talked her through breathing exercises. When the helicopter came, we both signed the report as a wildlife encounter with an unidentified large animal. That's what it was. That's what it had to be. But as the helicopter lifted away and I watched her get transported to Kalispell Regional Hospital, I knew that nothing was right about any of it. The animal didn't move like anything known. The way it had moved suggested intelligence, not just predatory instinct. The cabin felt different when I returned. The same physical space, but the atmosphere had shifted into something charged with violation. I'd been violated. My space had been violated, and the thing out there now knew that I knew what was happening. I spent the evening reinforcing the cabin. I wedged boards over windows that faced the forest. I moved my supplies to the main room and barricaded the bedroom doors from the inside. I set up a chair in the kitchen with a clear sight line to both entrances and kept the pistol in my lap. Sleep didn't happen. I existed in a state of hypervigilance, listening to every creak and groan of the old building. The propane heater ticked inside. The wind picked up off the lake. Around 2 a.m., I heard what sounded like something deliberately hitting the cabin wall. Not in a ramming way, but methodical. Thump. Pause. Thump. As if something was testing the integrity of the structure. I didn't investigate. I pointed the pistol at the door and waited. By dawn, the sounds had stopped. I was exhausted and running on adrenaline and coffee. I knew I needed to file a real incident report, the kind that would trigger a serious response. I called Victor directly on the radio. "I'm evacuating," I said. "I don't feel safe at the cabin. I'm requesting temporary reassignment, pending investigation of dangerous wildlife." The response was slow. "Are you injured?" "No. But I believe there's an immediate threat level that exceeds my training and equipment." "Understood. Pack your essentials. I'll be there by noon." I packed a bug-out bag. Important documents, some clothes, my personal laptop. I left everything else. The cabin could be replaced. My life was harder to restore. Victor arrived around 12:30, and this time he wasn't dismissive. Rebecca Cass had filed her own incident report from the hospital. She'd also called the media. A news crew from Missoula had already done a story on the mysterious creature in Glacier National Park, complete with animal experts disputing her account and Park Service officials requesting calm and suggesting wildlife misidentification. But Victor had seen the photos I'd taken, he'd reviewed the evidence, and he was taking it seriously. "Pack a go bag," he said. "We're going to get you out of here and then we're getting a team together." I was ready within 20 minutes. As Victor did a final walkthrough of the cabin, I stood on the porch looking at the lake. The water was a strange color, dark and reflective. The mountains seemed closer than they had when I arrived. The whole landscape looked like it was leaning inward, compressing the space, making the world smaller. I heard Victor call from inside. "The back bedroom window is open." I didn't go check, I went to the truck. We drove in silence for a long time. Then Victor said, quietly, "I believe you. I don't know what's happening out here, but I believe what you're describing is real in the way that matters. I was hoping I'd never have to deal with this." "What do you mean, you were hoping?" I asked. "Douglas left because of something like this. He never filed an official report. He claimed he needed to retire for health reasons. But I knew Douglas, he loved this job. There was no way he left willingly unless something had happened." "How long?" I asked. Douglas reported similar incidents starting in his 8th year. Footsteps, attempted entries, wildlife acting strangely. He described seeing something in the forest that he believed was an unidentified primate, possibly multiple individuals. He requested transfers 3 times. Each time, we offered to relocate him, but he insisted on staying in the position. I think he was trying to document something, to prove it." "Where is he now?" I asked. "Phoenix. He sent me a Christmas card last year with no return address." We drove down the mountain road, leaving the lake and the cabin and the forest behind. In the rearview mirror, I could see the ridge line where I'd first seen the figure in the water. I was reassigned to Kalispell headquarters for administrative leave pending investigation. My official status was as a ranger suffering from stress and psychological strain related to isolation. The unofficial reality was that the Park Service had a serious problem they didn't know how to address. The investigation that followed was strange and truncated. A team went out to the cabin. They examined my evidence. They conducted interviews with Rebecca Cass, who had gained her own following on social media, describing the encounter as definite proof of undiscovered primate species. The Park Service, meanwhile, issued a statement attributing the incident to wildlife misidentification and suggesting that the animals in question were likely black bears standing on hind legs, which can create an impression of bipedal humanoid shapes when visibility is poor. This explanation satisfied nobody, but it was the official story, and everyone knew it was a lie. I could see it in Victor's eyes when he briefed me on the findings, could see it in the rigid posture of the Park Service spokeswoman when she fielded questions from increasingly skeptical reporters. But nothing changed. No closure, no answers, just a cover story and a ranger who couldn't sleep without light and weapons. 4 weeks later, I requested one final patrol of the cabin before my permanent reassignment to a different sector. The request was denied initially, but Victor approved it. He drove me out himself, and we approached the cabin in daylight with a full team. The place looked untouched. Victor and 2 seasonal rangers conducted a thorough search while I stood in the main room where I'd spent weeks in fear. They found nothing unusual, no signs of forced entry, no damage that couldn't be explained as weathering and age. The prints had been washed away by rain and melt, the evidence had been erased. I went to the back bedroom and opened the window. The latch mechanism was in the closed position. It hadn't been touched, but I'd seen it open. I was certain of it. In the corner of the bedroom, I found something I hadn't noticed during my evacuation. A mark on the floor, barely visible, a pattern scratched into the wood with some kind of sharp object. It was deliberate. It was a message, or a warning, or something that had meaning that I didn't possess the framework to understand. I took a photo and left the cabin for the last time. The photo was examined by an anthropologist at the University of Montana who specialized in Native American symbolism. She identified it as possibly corresponding to Blackfoot or Kootenai designs, though the execution was crude and the meaning unclear. She suggested it might be an animal marking rather than human-created. That seemed to satisfy the official inquiries, but I knew what it meant. I don't know how I knew, but I was certain. It was an acknowledgement. A presence had been in that space with me, had been studying me, and had left a mark that said, "I was here. I know you know." In my final report, I wrote a detailed account of the events without drawing supernatural conclusions. I documented the physical evidence, the wildlife behavior, the footprints and marks. I described the encounters with objectivity and precision. and I recommended that the cabin be abandoned or relocated due to the presence of an undocumented large primate species that displayed habituation to human structures and possible predatory behavior. The Park Service never responded officially. The cabin was sealed for 3 years, then quietly reopened with a new ranger brought in from another district. That ranger lasted 6 weeks before requesting transfer. The truth is that I don't know what was happening at that cabin. I still don't know. The rational explanations fail because they don't account for the intentionality, the apparent intelligence, the psychological weight of being observed and evaluated. The supernatural explanations are impossible because I don't believe in supernatural things, but I believe in the unknown. I believe that there are places on this continent where human understanding fails, where the rules of documented biology and behavior don't quite hold. I believe that something was at Kootenai Lake, something that learned to walk upright, something that knew I was afraid, something that in the end chose to let me leave. The mark in the floor was the only thing that made sense. It said what I couldn't articulate. It said, I was here, and I am still here, and somewhere in the deep forests of Glacier National Park, it remains true. I took the position at Crow Lake specifically because nobody wanted it. That should have told me something. The job posting came through a regional forestry office buried in the Cumberland Mountains of eastern Tennessee. Seasonal ranger for a remote monitoring station, 3 months, March through May. Monitor wildlife patterns, check boundary markers, maintain equipment at the cabin on the northern shore of Crow Lake. It wasn't the kind of work that attracted most rangers. No visitor centers, no trails to maintain, no heroic rescues of unprepared hikers. Just solitude and trees and the kind of silence that makes your ears ring. I needed that silence more than I needed almost anything else. My name is Keita Brenner. I'm 42 years old, and I had spent the previous 8 years with the National Park Service working at 2 major parks. Before that, wilderness management in Colorado. I knew the work. I understood the regulations, the ecological monitoring protocols, the safety procedures. What I didn't know, what nobody really knows until they're there, is what it does to your mind when you're alone in the deep forest for weeks at a time. The cabin wasn't impressive. A single room with a cast iron stove, a cot with wool blankets, a small desk, a shelf of reference materials about local fauna, and a radio that worked maybe 60% of the time. The previous ranger, according to the notes, had lasted only through April before requesting transfer. He hadn't explained why in the official paperwork. Just noted that the position was unsuitable for extended deployment. I arrived on a Thursday in early March, driving up the narrow Forest Service road in a government truck. The route had been closed to public traffic for the better part of 15 years, ever since the Park Service had decided the area was better preserved without foot traffic. The road was barely maintained, full of washouts and root systems breaking through the asphalt. It took 40 minutes to drive the final 5 miles. The cabin appeared suddenly as the road crested a ridge. Below it, through the dense growth of bare hardwoods and evergreens, I could see the gray surface of Crow Lake. The water was still except where wind channeled down from the mountain peaks. The cabin itself was built in the old style, logs stacked and chinked, with a metal roof that showed rust around the flashing. Someone had boarded the windows on the western side. That struck me as odd. The eastern side facing the lake had functional shutters but no boards. I spent the first day settling in. The cabin was clean though dusty. The previous occupant had shut things down properly. The propane heater worked. The water pump ran. There was a generator for the radio and the small refrigerator, though I was told to use it sparingly to preserve fuel. The outhouse was 50 yards north, downwind in a small clearing surrounded by dense thicket. On the second day, I began my first patrol of the monitoring stations. There were 4 locations marked on the map, each with a locked box containing data recorders and humidity sensors. The work was straightforward. Check the instruments, record the readings, note any animal sign or environmental changes. The entire circuit took about 7 hours of hiking. That first week, nothing seemed unusual. The forest was emerging from winter. Early spring flowers were beginning to push through the leaf litter. I found numerous deer tracks, black bear scat from animals recently emerged from winter dens, and the skeletal remains of what looked like a porcupine killed by some predator. That was normal. The forest operates on a logic of hunger and sustenance. Everything there is either eating or being eaten. On my 8th night at the cabin, I heard singing. It wasn't loud. It came from across the lake, somewhere in the eastern ridge where the mountains rose in a series of rocky outcrops. The sound was carried across the water on the wind, making it difficult to pinpoint. It was a human voice, I was certain, though the melody was unlike anything I recognized. It had a quality that made my nervous system react before my conscious mind understood why. The cadence was wrong. The intervals between notes didn't follow any musical structure I had ever heard. I went outside with a flashlight. The night was clear, probably 38 degrees. The lake's surface reflected starlight in a way that made it seem like black glass. I stood on the small dock that extended from the cabin's rear and listened. The singing continued for perhaps 4 minutes, then stopped abruptly. Not fading away, not tapering into silence, complete cessation, as if someone had turned off a recording. In the morning, I told myself it was probably someone camping illegally in the park. I noted it in the daily log. That was procedure. But I also found myself checking the cabin doors that night before sleeping, something I hadn't done the previous week. By the third week, I had established a routine. Morning coffee. First patrol of the week to a different monitoring station. Afternoon spent on equipment maintenance or record keeping. Evening spent reading the books on the cabin shelf, mostly technical forestry manuals and 2 mystery novels left behind by a previous tenant. The isolation no longer felt oppressive, it felt cleansing. Then I found the first track. I was checking the northwestern monitoring station, the one that sat on a ridge approximately 2 miles from the cabin. The path was well established, marked with old survey ribbon and cairns. I had hiked it twice already without incident. On this occasion, coming back toward the cabin through the thick understory of rhododendron, I noticed something odd about the ground, an impression in the soft earth of the trail. It was roughly humanoid but wrong in several ways. Too large, certainly. The stride was too long, and the arrangement of whatever had made it suggested a foot structure that wasn't quite human, though the overall pattern was undeniably bipedal. I crouched to examine it more closely. The print was deep, suggesting considerable weight. Dirt had begun to crumble slightly at the edges, which meant it was at least several hours old, possibly from the previous evening. I took photographs with my Ranger camera, noting the precise location on my GPS unit. In the margin of my patrol log, I wrote, "Large unidentified print, likely bear, possible human activity," but I knew it wasn't a bear track. I had been in the field long enough to recognize bear signs. The weight distribution was completely different. That night, the singing came again. It was closer this time, coming from the western side of the lake. The same discordant melody, the same wrong intervals. This time I could make out that it was almost vocalizing words, though I couldn't understand the language. The quality of the voice was unusual as well. It had a rasping undertone, like someone singing through damaged vocal cords, yet maintaining clear pitch despite the underlying hoarseness. I sat in the cabin with the door locked and the radio on, listening to static and the occasional distant transmission from other ranger stations. I didn't sleep that night. Around 3 in the morning, I heard what sounded like something large moving through the forest surrounding the cabin. Not rushing, not panicked. A deliberate, methodical movement, like something circling the perimeter. By dawn, the sounds had stopped. The printed materials in the cabin were limited, but there was one book that I had overlooked initially. It was wedged behind the technical manuals, a small journal with a leather cover. When I pulled it out, I recognized it as a previous ranger's personal log. The dates indicated it had been written 5 years earlier, during a season identical to mine. The first entry began normally enough, describing the same arrival process, the same layout of the cabin, the same initial sense of purpose. By the 3rd week of that ranger's tenure, the tone had changed. "Strange sounds from the eastern ridge," one entry read. "Almost musical, but not animal calls I recognize. Not wolves, not coyotes. Something larger. Something that doesn't match any known sound in my reference materials." Another, dated 2 weeks later. "Found tracks near the northwestern station. Large, approximately bipedal, but the stride pattern is incorrect for human activity. The foot structure suggests something not documented in the region. Requested wildlife identification from regional office. Received response stating no unusual sightings reported elsewhere in the park." The final entry was dated May 2nd. "I'm leaving early. Something is wrong here. The singing has become a constant feature. It comes from different locations each night, as though something is circling the lake, measuring the distance, testing the perimeter. Last night I heard it directly across from the cabin, approximately 100 yards offshore, though I've carefully searched the lake shore and found no launch point for any boat. The track patterns continue to expand. I've now found them in a complete circuit around the cabin's immediate area. The thing, whatever it is, has walked around the cabin at night. Multiple nights, different locations. I verified this through sand disturbances on the dock and prints in the soft earth behind the outhouse. The last time I heard the singing, it was followed by a sound I can only describe as a scream. Not an animal scream, not quite human either, but the quality of agony in the sound was unmistakable. I cannot explain this to my superiors because there is nothing specific I can report. No attack, no direct threat. But something here is wrong. Something in these mountains is not cataloged, not classified, not accountable to any wildlife management system in existence. The entry ended there. The pages that followed were blank. I closed the journal carefully and placed it back behind the technical manuals. I told myself it was possible that the previous ranger had experienced an extended period of isolation psychosis. It was a documented phenomenon. Extended solitude, combined with environmental stressors and limited human contact, could create psychological patterns that resembled a genuine external threat. The symptoms aligned: the escalating sense of being monitored, the confirmation bias in interpreting natural phenomena as intentional surveillance. But I had come to Crow Lake specifically to escape human contact. I had come because after 8 years of working in major parks with dozens of coworkers, after 7 months dealing with the aftermath of a failed engagement and a career stall, I had wanted to know if I could still exist in deep silence. I had wanted to discover if I was still the person who had become a ranger in the first place, or if I had been worn down into someone smaller. The singing didn't come for 4 days after I read the journal. I tried to return to my normal routines. I completed my circuit of monitoring stations. I maintained the cabin. I documented local wildlife sightings and weather patterns. I was methodical and professional, but every sound made me alert. Every rustle in the surrounding forest seemed to carry intention. On the 5th day, while I was approximately half a mile from the cabin conducting an equipment check, I found 3 more tracks in a soft patch of earth near a small creek. They were fresh, made within the last few hours. The tracks showed the same characteristics as the one I had found previously. Oversized, bipedal, with a stride that suggested something 7.5 to 8 feet tall if the proportions were correct. The spacing indicated rapid movement, perhaps running. In the creek bed itself, I found something else. A piece of cloth, shredded and wet, caught on a submerged branch. The fabric was blue, partially decayed. When I pulled it free, I recognized it as belonging to a hiking jacket. Not new, the decomposition and water damage suggested it had been there for weeks, possibly months. There was a faint dark stain on one section of the fabric that looked like blood. I immediately radioed the regional office. It took 3 attempts before I made contact. I reported the location of the cloth and described my discovery. The response from the dispatcher was professional but non-committal. She said they would file a report and check missing persons databases. She asked if there was any evidence of a body. I said no. She advised me to avoid the area and continue my normal duties. That night, the singing came from the north. It was louder now, carrying a new element that made my response to it more visceral. The melody had developed what sounded like lyrics, words formed in a language I didn't recognize but with a familiar cadence underneath, as though someone had taken English phonetics and stretched them into something other. The voice quality had changed as well. There seemed to be multiple tones to it now, as if more than one throat was producing the sound, but perfectly synchronized so that it maintained singular continuity. I built up the fire in the stove and left every lamp burning. I checked the ammunition in my ranger's sidearm, though I had never fired it in the field and had barely trained with it. The weapon felt inadequate. Against what? I wasn't certain. I just knew that the standard precautions felt useless against whatever was producing the singing. Around midnight I heard something at the rear of the cabin, the outhouse. I could hear it being moved. The small wooden structure, which weighed perhaps 200 pounds, was being shifted position. The sound of wood scraping against earth, then being set down. There was a pause, and then I heard the sound of the door opening. Something was inside. I wanted to believe it was an animal, a bear perhaps, or a large deer. But the deliberation of the movement, the systematic quality of it, suggested intelligence, purpose. The thing spent approximately 10 minutes inside the outhouse. Then it closed the door and moved away. I heard it walking through the surrounding forest. The sound of something large moving without particular stealth, simply moving at its own pace, unconcerned with being detected. The footsteps circled to the rear of the cabin and then moved away toward the lake. In the morning, I examined the outhouse. The structure hadn't been damaged. Inside, everything appeared normal. There was no evidence of disturbance. but on the outside, on the rear wall that faced away from the cabin, I found a mark. It was vaguely handprint-shaped, made in dark material that I initially thought was dirt. But when I examined it more closely, I realized it was feces. Something had pressed a handful of excrement against the cabin's adjacent building, leaving a deliberate message, a territorial marking, a sign. I had read enough about predator behavior to understand what was happening. Something had established that the cabin was within its range. It was testing boundaries, communicating presence. The next phase in that progression was typically escalation. I called the regional office again and requested emergency transfer. The dispatcher seemed surprised by my tone. I explained that I had found evidence of unusual wildlife behavior that I wasn't qualified to assess, and that I felt the situation warranted professional investigation by someone with expertise in large predator management. She asked me to provide details. I found myself unable to adequately describe what was happening. How could I explain a smell that wasn't quite animal and wasn't quite human? How could I convey the architectural logic of behavior that suggested something operating with human intelligence but animal motivation? After a long pause, the dispatcher said that all rangers were currently deployed on higher priority assignments. She suggested I complete my contract. She said that if I felt in immediate danger, I should evacuate. But the tone of her voice suggested that evacuation was something she hoped I wouldn't request. I stayed. 2 days later, I found the body. I had been conducting routine maintenance on the dock, checking the posts and the weatherproofing compound, when I noticed something floating near the rocky eastern shore about 40 yards from the dock. At first, I thought it was a piece of driftwood or debris from an old campsite. As I got closer, I understood what I was actually looking at. The body was male, clothed in remnants of what had once been a lightweight hiking outfit. The decomposition was advanced, suggesting the corpse had been in the water for weeks, possibly months. Fish and water predators had begun the work of reducing it to component parts. What remained was fundamentally unrecognizable as having once been human except for the basic structural architecture of the skeleton and the larger muscle groups that hadn't yet been entirely consumed. I forced myself to conduct a professional examination. No identification on the person. The clothing seemed to date from within the last year based on the degradation state. The injury patterns on the remaining bone were consistent with traumatic damage from a powerful force. Both arm bones showed fractures that suggested gripping and tearing. One leg bone was broken, and the fracture site showed gnaw marks indicating consumption of the flesh. Using a pole and a net, I managed to pull the body to the rocky shore. I documented everything with photographs. The regional office, when I finally reached them, took the call with the seriousness that a confirmed fatality warranted. They said they would contact the county sheriff and the state medical examiner. They said they would arrange transportation. They asked if I was safe. I told them yes, though the answer wasn't accurate. The investigation that followed took 3 days. A team from the county came in through the road. State police, a medical examiner. They conducted their work with the professionalism that such situations require. The body was identified through dental records as a male named Marcus Hodges, age 34. Who had been reported missing 6 weeks earlier while attempting a solo wilderness hike in the region. The injury patterns were consistent with a predator attack, though the type of predator was not immediately clear. The local authorities seemed to believe it was consistent with a large bear attack, and they began talking about a potentially dangerous animal in the area that would need to be tracked. On the second night of the investigation, the singing came while the state police were still present. The officers looked at each other with uncertainty. One of them asked what that sound was. I told them I wasn't certain. It seemed to come from somewhere in the eastern ridge, though the acoustics of the mountains made it difficult to determine the precise location. The other officer, a lieutenant named Crest, said it sounded like someone trying to vocalize. He suggested it might be a mountain lion or a large bear, but his voice carried doubt. The singing continued for perhaps 15 minutes, then faded. In the ensuing silence, Lieutenant Crest asked if I had heard such sounds before. I told him yes, that I had been documenting them. That was when he asked to see my logs. I showed him the entries I had written, matter-of-factly documented without the psychological weight that my journal entries carried. The lieutenant read through them carefully. When he finished, he folded the log shut and looked at me directly. "This sounds like something intelligent," he said. "I know," I replied. "Not something wild. I don't think it is." He was quiet for a long moment. Then he asked if I had any previous encounters with Appalachian folklore, with local legend. I told him I wasn't specifically researching that. He said that in his experience working this region there were stories that predated European settlement, Stories about entities that lived in the deep mountains, that moved at night, that communicated in ways that humans sometimes heard and sometimes understood. He said that most rangers dismissed such talk as superstition. He said he had worked here most of his career and had come to respect that people in the region knew things that didn't make it into wildlife management textbooks. He left the cabin and walked to the eastern shore of the lake. I watched from the window as he stood looking out at the dark water and the ridge beyond. After approximately 5 minutes, he returned. "Whatever did this," he said, indicating the location where the body had been recovered, "wasn't interested in the corpse as sustenance. The body was arranged deliberately on the rocks, not cached in the manner a predator typically leaves a kill. It was positioned for visibility, for discovery." I understood what he was suggesting. Something had killed Marcus Hodges and then ensured that the body would be found. By the next day, the investigation had been officially concluded. The working theory was that a large predator, likely a black bear of exceptional size, had attacked the hiker. The death was ruled accidental, occurring during wildlife encounter. The recommendations included closing the area to public access and authorizing wildlife management to assess the predator population. But before Lieutenant Crest departed, he pulled me aside. "I've been doing this for 28 years, he said. "I've investigated maybe 30 deaths related to wildlife in Appalachian terrain. The patterns never look like this. The presentation never feels like this. And the lake, for as long as people have lived near it, has had stories attached to it." "What kind of stories?" I asked. "The kind where something that isn't quite animal and isn't quite human comes down from the ridge and draws things toward it. The kind where people who go missing in the mountains sometimes come back, but they're not the people who left. The kind where singing in the night means something to people who understand the language, and it always means something bad is coming." "Do you believe those stories?" I asked. "I believe that folklore contains encoded information about genuine dangers," he said. "I believe that the people in this region have been living beside something for centuries, and they've developed responses based on that coexistence. I believe that what you're experiencing is not new to this place." He left that evening, and the authorities departed the next morning. I was alone again at Crow Lake, but now I was alone with confirmation that something here was dangerous. Something here had killed before and would likely kill again. I had been considering evacuation. I had been contemplating whether I could justify to myself leaving early, whether that represented acceptable prudence or cowardly abandonment of a responsibility I had volunteered for. The decision was made for me on the 7th night after the body's discovery. I was preparing dinner around 6 in the evening when I heard something on the roof. Not a sound of walking, more like something dragging itself across the metal surface. A slow, deliberate movement, starting at the rear of the cabin and working toward the front. Then it stopped, and there was silence. I stood in the cabin's center listening. The dragging sound resumed, now moving laterally along the roof's length. Then it stopped again. I opened the door cautiously. In the fading light, I could see something on the cabin's roof, silhouetted against the darkening sky. It was vaguely humanoid, but the proportions were wrong. The limbs were too long, the torso too compact. It was moving in a way that seemed to involve using all 4 limbs simultaneously, scuttling across the roof's surface with an efficiency that suggested that bipedalism was not its natural mode of locomotion. When it became aware that I had opened the door, it stopped moving. We regarded each other across the distance. Even in the poor light, I could sense the attention it was directing toward me, the focus of something that had recognized potential prey. It began moving again, deliberately toward the front of the cabin. I stepped back inside and closed the door. I could hear it on the roof directly above me, moving with increasing speed as though it was working itself toward some kind of conclusion. Then it stopped. The silence that followed was worse than any sound. I stood in the cabin, every muscle tensed, waiting for what would come next. The singing began, but it was different now. It was coming from directly above my head, from something pressed against the interior of the roof, as though the creature was singing from inside the structure that housed me. The quality of the vocalizations had changed completely. There was no longer any pretense of melody or even of recognizable language structure. It was pure articulation of sound, designed to maximize distress in a human nervous system. The frequencies shifted in ways that seemed designed to trigger panic responses. Underneath the primary vocalization, I could hear wet, rasping breathing, as though something with compromised respiratory capacity was expending tremendous effort to produce the sound. I did the only thing I could think of. I took the rifle I had stored in the cabinet, loaded it, and fired upward through the cabin's ceiling. The sound of the gunshot was deafening in the enclosed space. The impact punched a hole through both the interior and the metal roof. There was a moment of absolute silence, Then something large rolled down the roof slope and fell to the ground behind the cabin with a sound of impact that seemed to shake the entire structure. I stood frozen, rifle still raised, ears ringing from the gunshot. Outside there was no movement, no sound. The wind in the surrounding forest seemed unnaturally still, as though the natural world had paused to witness what came next. I didn't sleep that night. I sat by the fire with the rifle across my lap, monitoring the cabin's perimeter. Sometime before dawn I heard it moving away, traveling toward the eastern ridge with a sound of something dragging itself, possibly injured. The singing had stopped. The attention seemed to have withdrawn. When daylight came, I examined the area behind the cabin. There was no blood, no evidence of an injury. Tracks in the soft earth suggested a large bipedal creature, and they were smeared with what looked like ash or desiccated material. The being had apparently shed skin or some kind of exterior covering during its retreat. I called the regional office and informed them that I was requesting emergency evacuation due to imminent threat to personal safety. This time there was no hesitation. They said they would send a truck to retrieve me. It would take approximately 4 hours to reach the cabin. In the interim, they advised me to remain inside with the door locked. As I waited, I read the end of the previous ranger's journal once more. The final entry that I had not read thoroughly now took on new meaning. The ranger had not written about cowardice or fear overtaking reason. The ranger had written about understanding, about the realization that what existed in the mountains surrounding Crow Lake was not something that would ever be photographed or classified or managed through standard wildlife protocols. It was something that existed in the spaces between comprehension and denial, in the realm where folklore describes genuine danger that civilization has simply chosen not to acknowledge. The ranger had left because staying would have meant complicity in something that transcended the job description of a forest monitor. The truck arrived at 2 in the afternoon. The driver was a young man named Raphael, who worked for the regional office. He seemed genuinely concerned about my well-being, which was refreshing after the bureaucratic distance of the previous conversations. I had packed my personal items and secured the cabin as best I could. I locked the door and took a final look at the location that had been my home for 35 days. As we drove down the Forest Service road, I asked Raphael if he had ever heard stories about Crow Lake. He hesitated before responding. He said that people in the towns surrounding the park had local stories, but that most rangers dismissed them as folklore without basis. He said the current management philosophy was to focus on documented science and not to perpetuate unsubstantiated narratives that might frighten hikers or camping enthusiasts. But that's not actually true, is it? I asked. The park actually closed certain areas to public access because something here represents a genuine threat. Raphael didn't respond immediately. After a long pause, he said that things were more complex than official policy suggested. He said that rangers who worked in certain locations for extended periods sometimes experienced something that shifted their understanding of what was possible. He said that the service functioned in a state of institutional denial about certain phenomena because acknowledging those phenomena would necessitate operational changes that management wasn't prepared to implement. "They'll want to hear that you experienced isolation psychosis," he said quietly. "They'll want to frame this as an extended solitude creating psychological patterns that felt real but were manifestations of a stressed mind." "And what do you think?" I asked. "I think that Crow Lake has been closed to public access for a reason that's never been formally documented. I think that Marcus Hodges isn't the first death attributed to predator activity in this region, and I think that the sound you heard, the creature you fired on, is something that the Park Service has been living beside for decades while pretending it doesn't exist." The ride to the nearest ranger station took most of the afternoon. I completed a formal report detailing the body discovery and my observations of unusual wildlife behavior. I described the creature only in the most clinical terms, emphasizing that identification was impossible from the encounter. I allowed the official narrative to stand unchallenged, that I had experienced an extended isolation that had created psychological patterns that felt significant but lacked objective verification. But in my own copy of the report, I documented everything: the behavior patterns, the tracks, the singing, the manner of the creature's movement, the deliberate way it had positioned itself on the roof, as though it was testing the boundaries of human shelter itself. 3 weeks later, I was offered a position at another park. The regional office wanted me back in the field, they said, but at a location with more support infrastructure. They wanted me working where there were other rangers nearby, where I wouldn't be alone. I accepted the position, but I kept the notes I had made at Crow Lake. and I began reading everything I could about Appalachian folklore, about historical sightings and encounters, about the layers of indigenous knowledge that had been dismissed by Western science as superstition. I began to understand that what I had encountered existed in the spaces where human civilization had not yet obliterated the knowledge of danger. The creature, if creature is the right word, still lives in the mountains surrounding Crow Lake. Lieutenant Crest was right that folklore encodes genuine dangers. The Park Service continues to manage the area as a location of restricted access. They issue warnings to hikers about predator activity and recommend that people avoid the region during certain seasons. They do everything possible to prevent human contact with whatever exists there, while maintaining official silence about what that whatever actually is. On quiet nights when I'm at my current posting or at my apartment during off-season, I sometimes remember the quality of that singing, the way it carried intention, the way it seemed designed to communicate across the distance between what we are and what something else is. I understand now why the previous ranger left. I understand why Lieutenant Crest spoke with such careful certainty about entities that officially do not exist. There are things in the deep forests of this continent that predate human civilization. Things that have learned to coexist with our expansion by remaining just beyond the edges of our acknowledgement. The mountains keep their secrets, and we maintain the pretense of ignorance because the alternative would require acknowledging that we are not the only intelligences moving through wilderness areas at night. I accepted the position at Crow Lake because I needed silence, because I wanted to discover if I could still exist in deep isolation. What I discovered instead was that I was not as isolated as I believed, that the wilderness does not exist as empty space waiting for human observation, that the singing in the dark carries meaning for those who are willing to understand, and that some knowledge once acquired cannot be unknown. I took the job at Glacier because I needed to disappear, not in the way people usually mean it, though that was part of it. I'd spent 12 years in Missoula working search and rescue, and the last 2 of those years had carved something hollow out of my chest. Every call was the same. Families with desperate eyes, hikers who'd underestimated the wilderness, bodies found too late in ravines they never should have entered. The accumulation of it wears you down, the weight of other people's mistakes, their assumptions that nature could be conquered with determination and optimism. My supervisor saw it coming. He offered me a transfer before I asked for one. Glacier National Park needed a backcountry ranger for the northern quadrant, a seasonal position that would keep me alone in the mountains for months at a time. One cabin, a lake, the kind of assignment most rangers avoided because the solitude drove people insane. For me, solitude sounded like salvation. I arrived in late April, when the snow still held the pass closed and the lodge in West Glacier felt like a small settlement on the edge of nowhere. The district manager, a compact man named Victor Reeves who'd been with the Park Service for 30 years, gave me a tour of the equipment room and briefed me on the basics. Water quality checks, trail maintenance, seasonal wildlife monitoring, keep an eye out for illegal backcountry camping, stay in radio contact twice weekly, minimum. You'll have visitors, Victor said, handing me a map marked with established campsites. Permits go out a few months ahead. Most years we get 50, maybe 60 people rotating through the northern sector in a season, 50 hikers across 100,000 acres. I nodded and committed the numbers to memory, already calculating how many weeks of genuine solitude that meant between human contact. The cabin sat 3 miles in from the ranger station, accessible by a narrow trail that switchbacked up through old-growth Douglas fir and larch. The Forest Service had maintained it for 40 years. Inside, it was exactly what I needed. A cast-iron stove, a propane lantern, a radio mounted above a small desk, and a bed with a real mattress. A window faced north toward the higher peaks, where snow wrapped the summits like crowns. A small lake, maybe 50 acres, lay a quarter-mile from my back door, clear enough that you could see 20 feet down into the mineral-bright water. The first 2 weeks were quiet, in the way wilderness can be. I repaired fence lines where elk had broken through. I cleared brush from the south trail. I walked the shoreline of the lake, noting water clarity, taking samples. At night, I read books I'd been meaning to finish for years. The silence was absolute except for wind in the high branches and the occasional call of a raven. On May 18th, I got my first radio call. A permit holder, a woman named Judith Voss, was hiking in with 2 companions. They'd be at Camp Sorensen, the main established site on the northwestern approach, for 5 days. Standard protocol. I confirmed receipt and made a note in the logbook. I should have paid closer attention to that notation. I should have done something different on the night they arrived. The weather turned that evening. Storm systems had been building across the ridge all day, and by sundown, the clouds had dropped their ceiling to maybe 2,000 feet. I stood on the cabin porch and watched the darkness gather. The wind was starting to have an edge to it, that particular cold that carries the promise of lightning and hail. Nothing unusual for late spring in the high country. I went to bed around 11. The knocking woke me sometime after 2 in the morning. Not at the door, at the window. A sound like something solid hitting the glass, deliberate and rhythmic. 3 times, then silence. I lay in the dark, listening. My hand had already moved to the flashlight on my nightstand, which was training more than thought. In CR, you learn to wake completely and assess before moving. The knocking didn't resume. Wind sometimes hits cabins at odd angles, and falling branches can surprise you, but I waited a full minute with my hand on that flashlight before switching it on. The window was dark. I pointed the beam outside and saw only rain sheets and the violent movement of tree branches. Nothing struck the glass when I looked. I checked the other windows. All clear. The radio was silent. I was alone. I got back in bed but didn't sleep for another hour. The next morning brought no trace of storm damage around the cabin. The rain had stopped by dawn. The wind had dropped. I made coffee and walked the trail toward Camp Sorensen, intending to check in with Voss's group, confirm they'd weathered things okay, and remind them about bear canisters. The trail was muddy but manageable. As I climbed toward the higher elevation, I noticed the trees seemed quieter than before. The birds that had been constant the first weeks were absent. No jays, no ravens. Just wind through the needles and the sound of my own breathing. Camp Sorensen sits in a clearing near a small tarn, sheltered enough for tent camping but exposed enough that you get warning of weather changes. I saw the 3 tents from 50 yards away set up in proper configuration with bear canisters stashed at distance. Judith Voss was standing near the fire ring when I approached, and something about her posture made me slow my pace. "Morning," I called out. "How was the weather overnight?" She turned toward me, and I saw the problem immediately. Her face was wrong. Not injured, but wrong in a way that took me a moment to identify. Her eyes were too wide, with too much white showing. Her mouth had the tension of something held in a specific shape against its natural inclination. "Fine," she said. "We were fine. Everyone settled? Supplies good? Everyone is fine. We're fine." She said it the same way both times, the words empty of variation or authenticity. Behind her, a man emerged from one of the tents. He had the same quality in his face, the same unnatural stillness in the way he stood. A second person, a woman, remained inside the largest tent. "I'll check back in a few days," I told Voss. "You have the emergency frequency?" "Yes. If anything comes up, anything at all, you get on the radio. This is a serious wilderness area. Cell service is nowhere." "We know," Voss said. "We'll be careful." I hiked back to the cabin. The wrongness of their faces stayed with me, the odd quality of their stillness. Heat exhaustion maybe, altitude affecting them, dehydration caused strange mental states. I wasn't a doctor. It wasn't my place to pull them out unless they actually requested help. But that night, the knocking came again. 3 strikes against the window. Not random. Deliberate. Measured like someone was testing the glass, testing my response. I grabbed the flashlight and moved to the window, but as before, there was nothing visible in the darkness. Just rain and wind, and the undefined shapes of the forest at night. I opened the window that time and leaned out. "Who's there?" The wind caught my voice and scattered it. No response, no movement in the brush. Just the vast black nothing of the forest, indifferent and absolute. I closed the window and locked it. Then I locked the other windows. I sat up the rest of that night with the lamp on and my radio at hand, waiting for something I couldn't name. By morning, I'd made a decision. I filed a report with Victor about the permit holders, nothing specific, just a notation that they'd seemed under stress and that I'd do a closer check. He confirmed receipt and said he'd put a note in the file. 2 days of monitoring, he advised. Hiking that terrain could hit people hard. I tried to accept that explanation. I walked the trails. I maintained the fence lines. I checked water samples. And every night, the knocking came. 3 strikes, no variation. No answer when I called out. On the 4th night, I got the radio call I'd been dreading. Static first, then a voice I almost didn't recognize. Judith Voss's voice, but stripped of the wrongness that had inhabited her face at the camp. "Ranger." Her voice was tight with genuine fear, the first authentic emotion I'd heard from her. "Ranger, we need help. Something's wrong. Something's very wrong, and we need help now." I reached Camp Sorensen in under 90 minutes, moving hard through terrain that should have taken longer. My training took over, our instincts moving me through the dangerous footing with minimal hesitation. Rain was falling again, light but constant, turning the rocks to wet black glass. The camp was abandoned. All 3 tents still stood. The bare canisters remained in place. Bedrolls lay untouched in the tents, though the tarps had been pulled back and the inside contents disturbed. Someone had searched through them, though nothing appeared to be missing. What struck me most was the fire ring. The ash arrangement was too deliberate, too geometric. Forms made into meaning by hands that understood intention. I radioed base. Camp Sorensen is empty. Equipment present. No sign of immediate departure. 3 hikers unaccounted for. Victor's voice came back tight with stress. Copy that. Are you safe there? I looked around the clearing. The tree line felt very close and very dark despite the afternoon hour. I'm secure. I'm going to do a perimeter check and then initiate a search pattern. Negative. Get back here. This is going to require a larger team. He was right. I knew he was right. Search and rescue protocol existed for reasons and I was alone. But something in my chest resisted the idea of leaving that clearing. The wrongness of it, the sense of something unfinished, pulled at me. I'll hike back, I said. EEA base 2 hours. I spent another 20 minutes photographing the camp, documenting the position of tents and canisters, noting the state of the fire ring. My training told me one story, that 3 hikers had been stressed and panicked and either gotten lost on the way down or made poor decisions. But something deeper, something in the specific quality of the silence and the absolute wrongness of those arranged ashes, told me a different story. I started back toward the cabin, intending to stop there and collect my pack before heading to the ranger station. But halfway there, near the junction where the South Trail branches off, I found the first piece. It was Judith Voss's permit ID, lying face up on a flat stone beside the trail. No water damage, no weathering, freshly placed. I photographed it before touching it, the SAR protocol running in autopilot while my conscious mind tried to explain how it had ended up there, why someone would have dropped it at that specific spot. By the time I reached the cabin, it was getting dark. I knew I should have pushed on to the ranger station, should have stuck to protocol. But a compulsion to know the shape of what was happening in my territory pulled me inside for my pack. And while I was there, I checked the window. The lake was visible from my porch, in late twilight. The water was calm, mirror clear in a way that water isn't usually calm at dusk. The surface had that quality of stillness that precedes storms, the holding of breath before violence. And in that mirror, I saw something moving at the far shore, a shape. Bipedal. Too large to be a person but moving like one, with that uncanny gait that's almost human but not quite. The proportions were wrong, the limbs too long, the movement all elbows and knees, bending at angles that made my eyes hurt when I tried to follow the articulation. I grabbed the binoculars from my desk. Through the lenses, the image clarified slightly but became more horrible in its clarity. The thing had a silhouette that was animal and human fused, broad in the shoulders but with a head that sat too far forward, and as I watched, it turned toward the cabin. The face was too dark to see clearly, but the sense of being observed, of being assessed, came through the binoculars like a physical pressure. I dropped them. When I looked back at the lake, the shape was gone. I made my decision then. I packed my emergency gear, filled my water containers, and locked the cabin. The walk to the ranger station in darkness was risky, but staying was worse. The trail was familiar enough that I could navigate it by memory and my headlamp. I moved carefully but steadily, aware of every sound, every break in the normal forest acoustics. I was 2 miles out when I heard the voices, not at the trail. Parallel to it, maybe 50 yards into the trees on my left. They were calling to each other in voices I almost recognized. The first was Judith Voss. The second was a man, but not a man from the permit group. The third was myself, my own voice, calm and professional. Check the perimeter. Make sure nothing gets out. I stopped walking. My hand had moved to the knife on my belt, though a blade against whatever was speaking in my voice seemed like a pathetic defense. The voices continued their exchange, using knowledge they shouldn't have possessed, dialogue from conversations I'd had alone in that cabin, private thoughts expressed in my vocabulary. I ran. The trail safety rules say never run in darkness. Broken ankles happen. People die from falls you could walk away from in daylight. But my training broke against something more primal, the absolute certainty that stopping, that staying, meant something worse than a broken ankle. I ran with my headlamp bouncing, illuminating root systems and rocks and nothing, just more forest receding behind me. The voices stopped chasing after half a mile. In the silence that followed, I heard only my own breathing and the sounds of my feet on the trail. By the time I reached the ranger station at West Glacier, my legs had nearly given out. I was shaking with exertion and adrenaline and something I couldn't name. Victor found me on the station porch at 11:47 p.m. "Jesus Christ," he said, then caught himself at my expression. "What happened? Where are the hikers?" I told him everything except the voices. I told him about the camp, the strange behavior, the figure at the lake. I told him about finding Voss's permit. He listened with the expression of someone processing information that didn't fit categories. His eyes getting harder as I spoke. "You're exhausted," he said when I finished. "You had a stressful encounter and your mind filled in gaps. We'll organize a team tomorrow morning. Full search pattern, but you're done for the night. You need to sleep and let your adrenaline settle." He had me admitted to the small staff clinic attached to the ranger station where a part-time nurse checked me for injuries and gave me something mild to help me sleep. The cabin, I learned, would be sealed until they understood what was happening. In the dark of that small clinic room, I lay awake and listened to the wind outside the window, knowing that Victor was wrong about my mind filling in gaps. My mind had filled in exactly nothing. The gaps had been filled by something else. Something patient and intelligent and deeply wrong in the way it understood human psychology well enough to use my own voice against me. And my understanding of what happened to Judith Voss and her companions, what was happening in the mountains I'd chosen as my refuge, crystallized into a shape I couldn't accept but couldn't deny. The search team found the remains near the lower lake, 4 miles southeast of Camp Sorensen, at the junction where two streams converged into a larger drainage. There were 3 sites scattered across a half-mile area, as though something had been playing with its food across the landscape before settling on a preferred location. I wasn't present for the actual discovery. Victor had confined me to the ranger station with clear orders not to participate in the search. But I was there when the coroner's initial report came through, read aloud in Victor's office in a voice that suggested he was still trying to find a rational framework for the information. The remains had been severely traumatized. Predation was the working theory, though the coroner was struggling to identify the specific predator. The pattern of injury didn't match bears, which has their specific signature of kills. Mountain lions were theoretically possible, but the scale was wrong, the violence was distributed wrong. Whatever had killed them had taken its time, had been deliberate, had been, according to the coroner's careful language, possibly consumed at least portions of the bodies before decomposition set in. "There's something else," the coroner said over the phone, his voice carrying a weight that meant the something else was the actual problem. "I'm looking at Rachel Brennan here, one of the 2 female hikers. Her jawbone shows signs of ante-mortem trauma. Someone broke her jaw while she was still alive. After that happened, she couldn't scream. The injuries that followed suggest she was conscious for most of them." Victor closed his eyes. I sat across from him and said nothing, because anything I said would be interpreted through the lens of someone who was hysterical, who had let imagination run wild in the mountains. The missing hiker, the 3rd member of Voss's group, was never found. Richard Lorne, according to his permit. Age 34, experienced backpacker, no record of mental health issues. He had simply vanished from the upper camp area, left behind nothing but his pack and his boots. National Forest Service investigators arrived the next day, followed by state police. A preliminary report was filed. A ranger had encountered a distressed permit holder. Upon investigation, 3 hikers were found deceased with traumatic injuries consistent with predation. The ranger was treated for acute stress disorder and was recommending for administrative leave pending full investigation. The investigation, I learned later, was already becoming an exercise in consensus reality management. The National Park Service didn't have a public story that fit what had happened. Rogue bear? No, bears don't kill that way. Illegal poacher with hunting traps? Possible, but the injuries didn't match. The coroner's report was carefully worded to allow for multiple interpretations, all of them fitting into categories that made sense, that could be explained in press releases. What the investigation did, very carefully, was not find evidence of the 4th corpse. Richard Lorne's remains were never recovered, and after 30 days his file was moved to cold case status, and the official recommendation was that he'd likely become disoriented, fallen into a ravine and been scattered by scavengers across an area too large to search completely. I knew the truth. Richard Lorne hadn't become disoriented, and he hadn't fallen anywhere. On my 2nd night at the ranger station, after everyone had gone home and the building was empty except for the night watch dispatcher, I found a note in my assigned room. My handwriting, but I hadn't written it. It contained coordinates, precise to the nearest 1/10 of a degree, and a single line below them. "He's still here. In the place where things that look like people keep their things. I recognized the coordinates. They were within a mile of my cabin. Victor had forbidden me from returning to the northern sector. The entire area was under investigation and would remain closed to public access for the foreseeable future. But I had training in moving through wilderness without being seen, and I had a compulsion stronger than any direct order. I left the ranger station at 11 p.m. during the shift change, carrying minimal gear. My plan was to be in and out in 3 hours, enough time to reach the coordinates and understand what was there before returning. I told myself that was the extent of my plan. The trail was different at night. Even with my headlamp, the familiar markers had become strange and shifted, so that I was never quite sure if I was where I thought I was. The forest felt more crowded than it did during the day, as though things moved in the darkness at distances just beyond my vision, waiting for me to slow down. The coordinates led me to a ridge face I'd never noticed before, or perhaps had chosen not to notice. At the base was the entrance to something, a gap between rocks wide enough to admit a person, opening down into darkness. Not a cave exactly, but a crevasse. A seam in the mountain that went down into earth and stone and something more absolute than darkness. I pointed my headlamp into it and saw nothing but absence. The passage led down at an angle, and as I descended, the rock walls became closer, my shoulders touching stone on both sides. My headlamp beams seemed to die in the darkness without ever hitting a far wall, as though the space expanded once you got inside, becoming larger as you descended. I found Richard Lorne approximately 40 feet down. He was arranged on a flat place where the crevasse widened slightly, his body positioned with meticulous care. His arms were placed at his sides, his legs together, his head tilted back slightly. He was naked, and his body was a catalog of injuries that shouldn't have allowed him to survive for even minutes. His face was intact, though his eyes had been removed. Geometric symbols had been carved into his exposed chest and abdomen, not deeply but with obvious intention, and around him, arranged in concentric circles, were objects, pieces of bone, strips of clothing, a boot that matched the ones at the upper camp, stones marked with symbols similar to those carved in his flesh. I moved forward, though every part of my nervous system screamed against it. As I approached the arrangement, I understood that I was looking at ritual, not madness, not random violence, but intentional ceremony. Something had taken its time, had been methodical, had been precise, and it had wanted me to find this. The note in my handwriting made that clear. The symbol carved into Richard Lorne's sternum was one I recognized. The same symbol that had arranged itself in the ashes at Camp Sorensen. A sound from deeper in the crevasse stopped my approach. Not a growl, not an animal sound, but a voice, my voice, speaking in conversation with another version of itself. It found the others. Good. It's learning how they think. It wants them to understand. That's why it left the path. The mountains remember everything. The mountains remember all the things that came before the walkers came. We just help the mountains remember. I moved backward, slowly, keeping my headlamp pointed at the dark behind the body, at the space from which the voices emanated. The descent had taken minutes. My retreat took longer. I climbed with my hands shaking so badly I nearly dropped the lamp. I didn't report what I'd found. I couldn't report it without exposing myself to the investigation, to questioning about how I'd found a sealed area, how I'd violated direct orders. I said nothing to anyone, but I left the National Park Service. Victor called it a medical discharge, acute stress disorder from the initial incident, recommendation for extended leave and psychological support. The paperwork moved quickly, with unusual efficiency, as though the National Park Service was eager to have me away from the premises. I was offered 6 months of paid leave and a suggestion to pursue counseling and consider whether law enforcement was really a good fit for my psychology. I took a cabin in a town called Whitefish, 50 miles from the national park, not close enough to tempt investigation, far enough to establish that I wasn't hiding or vanishing in ways that would invite attention. I found work as a private contractor doing trail maintenance for local land trusts, work that kept me in the mountains but in areas that felt, if not safe, at least monitored by the presence of other humans. But the things I heard in the mountains of northern Montana didn't stop happening. Other hikers went missing. Their remains were never found, and the reports were filed and forgotten by press cycles that needed fresher tragedies. And in the small town of Whitefish, strange things began to happen in my peripheral vision. People with that quality of wrongness in their faces, moving with angles that didn't quite match human joints, speaking in patterns that seemed rehearsed. By August of that year, I understood what I should have understood at the cabin, that I hadn't chosen to go to Glacier as a refuge. Something had called me there. And in accepting the job, I'd opened a door that nothing in the civilized world had equipped me to close. A woman checked into the Whitefish Arms Hotel in late August, and I knew immediately that she was different from the other wrong-faced things I'd been seeing. She had an authenticity that the others lacked, a coherence of expression that suggested human emotions reflected in human eyes. Her name was Rebecca, or that's what she told me when we ended up at the same coffee shop on 3 separate mornings. "You look like someone who walks in mountains," she said on the 4th morning, sitting down at my table without invitation. I should have refused the conversation. I should have left the coffee shop, but she had a quality that made isolation seem worse than engagement, and I was reaching the end of what solitude could sustain. "I used to," I said. "The National Park Service let you go. I read about it online, buried in an archived incident report. Park ranger in Glacier, incident with permit holders, classified closure for 30 days. She smiled. It was a real smile, not performance. "You saw something." I didn't respond, but she continued. "The things you saw, they existed long before Glacier National Park existed. Long before the National Park Service. Long before Europeans came to this continent. The Blackfeet people knew about them. The Crow, the Salish. They had a lot of names for the things that walk wrong and wear the faces of other creatures. The ones who know which sounds make humans hesitate and which movements hypnotize prey. The ones who remember how to hunt the way it was done before fire, before language." "That's folklore," I said. "Folklore is exactly what things that predate human understanding become. It's the only language humans have for experiences that don't fit categories." She leaned forward. "They got what they wanted from you, at least partially. They wanted a ranger who would understand that the parks aren't human places, they're older. And they're waking up to the fact that humans have forgotten what they are." "What do you want?" "To warn you. And to explain what's going to happen next." Rebecca told me things that should have sounded like madness. She explained that the National Park Service had known for decades that certain parks contained areas of high activity, places where the thing that wore human faces and moved on angles occurred at frequencies that couldn't be ignored. Glacier was one, Yellowstone was another. Grand Canyon held their nesting places where the rock carved out chambers that shouldn't have contained the quantities of bone evidence that rangers occasionally found when they weren't supposed to be looking. The service's response was pragmatic rather than protective. They managed the information, they transferred rangers who'd had direct encounters, offered medical discharges and paid leaves. They closed areas under environmental review and reopened them once evidence had decomposed or been scattered. They maintained the parks as places of beauty and tourism, and they maintained the things that preceded humanity in the parks, the reciprocal arrangement so old that nobody even talked about it anymore. "What do they want from me?" I asked. "They want you to acknowledge that your refuge wasn't a place. It was a recognition. You were never looking for solitude. You were looking for understanding of what you'd spent 12 years refusing to accept. That humans aren't the inheritors of these places. We're visitors. The things that predate us, the things that the mountains remember, they understand that. And you're beginning to understand it, which is why you can see them when most people can't. So they're marking me, they're incorporating you. By the time winter comes to the northern valleys, you'll start seeing the symbols more clearly. By spring, you'll be able to read them. By next summer, you'll understand things about the land that make human language seem like a child's approximation of thought. And eventually," she paused, and I saw something close to pity in her expression, "you'll be like me, someone who walked too far into that recognition and couldn't walk back out." I left the coffee shop without finishing our conversation, walked back to my cabin in the mountains outside Whitefish, and tried to assemble a rationality that could contain what she'd said. I failed. The empirical mind rebels against such information, but the part of me that had stood at the lake's shore at dusk and seen the thing that was not quite animal and not quite human accepted every word as accurate. Over the next weeks, the symbols became clearer. I saw them in tree bark, in the arrangement of stones along the trail I maintained, in the patterns of frost on my window. They weren't random, they were intentional. Breadcrumbs for something that had already marked me as comprehensible. In September, a new hiker entered my area. Young, probably early 20s, clearly experienced despite his youth. He introduced himself as Kevin and asked if I knew the best trail to the remote lakes. I should have warned him. I should have told him the mountains weren't safe, and that his safety and the mountain's safety were operating under different parameters now. Instead, I gave him the route he requested, trying to convince myself that one more thing happening wouldn't change anything. He came back to my cabin 3 days later, not as Kevin. Kevin's face and form were there, but the thing looking out through Kevin's eyes was patient and ancient and approximately as interested in my welfare as a mining company is interested in the welfare of the rocks. The human left his body near the cold water, it said in a voice made from Kevin's vocal cords but shaped by something that understood language as external performance. He maintained reasonable awareness through most of the process, that one understood better than most. The recognition had already begun in him before we met. He was ready to see. I moved to the window, though I knew flight was no longer an option. The mountains had always contained this. Glacier was simply where I'd been made to see it directly. "What do you want?" I asked. "For you to finish the process. To understand all the way down to the place where human meaning dissolves into older structures. Then we'll decide where you're useful." It left before dark, Kevin's body moving with those broken angles back toward the deep forest. I sat in my cabin and waited for the knocking at the window that would come when the sun finally set. I understood now that the knocking had never been a test. It had been a call, and answering it, trying to understand it, had moved me toward a recognition that civilized life simply isn't structured to accommodate. By October, I was spending my days in the mountains and my nights in the cabin, existing in a space between. The symbols on the trees had become conversations. The movement of animals when I saw them seemed to be deliberate communication, messages arranged in patterns that my mind was beginning to decode. I was afraid, but the fear was abstract now, the theoretical fear of someone watching a process happen to themselves that they can't interrupt or control. I understood why Rebecca had that particular expression when she looked at me. The first snow came early that year, in October, and it changed everything. The mountains transformed into something that felt more honest, shedding the last pretense that they were a landscape designed for human tourism or even human comprehension. The snow was thick and wet, the kind that bends tree branches under its weight and creates acoustic changes in the forest that make distances mean something different. That's when the final summons came, not through the radio or in a note in my handwriting, but through a dream so coherent, it couldn't be distinguished from waking. I was to go to the upper lake at Glacier, to the place where I'd first seen the figure at dusk. The coordinates were exact, the time was the winter solstice, and the instruction was absolute. I was to come alone. I was to come at the moment of sunset, and I was to come understanding that this was not a request. I spent the weeks leading up to that day putting my affairs in order with a strange detachment. I left a letter to Victor explaining nothing, because explaining would require language for things that don't translate into the human categories of experience. I sold my cabin. I transferred my accounts to a mechanism that would maintain themselves without human intervention. I wrote nothing about Kevin because what happened to Kevin had stopped being a crime the moment he entered the mountains with recognition already beginning in him. The hike to the upper lake took me through territory that had changed in subtle ways. The trail was easier now, as though the forest was actively guiding me toward my destination rather than simply existing in the space around it. The symbols were everywhere, and I could read them as clearly as text now, understanding that they were not language in the human sense but something closer to the direct transfer of meaning, understanding pressed into the physical world by minds that existed before thought required articulation. I arrived as the sun was touching the peaks, painting them red and gold against the gathering darkness. The lake was frozen, a solid sheet of ice that looked black in the fading light, and arranged in a semicircle at the shore's edge were the others. There were 7 of them. 6 had human faces that were recognizable, people I'd seen in my months in Whitefish, the wrong-faced things that had been forming the perimeter of my recognition. And 1 was in between, still maintaining Kevin's basic shape but with the wrongness becoming translucent, the human form becoming transparent as the older form beneath it came into focus. "You came complete," the one that was closest to Kevin said. It was spoken as an observation rather than a greeting. I didn't respond. I was past the point where response required language. I stepped onto the ice. As I did, the others began to move. Not aggressively, but in a pattern that I recognized from the symbols. The same geometric arrangement I'd seen in the caves beneath the mountain where Richard Lorne had been placed. I was the center of the configuration. I was both observer and observed, subject and object, the point at which the pattern found completion. The ice beneath my feet began to crack. Not from weight, but from intention. Cracks that spread in geometric patterns, spreading the same symbols outward from my position, marks burned into the frozen water like a seal being pressed into wax. I understood then what was happening. This was the final acknowledgement, the moment at which I stopped being human in any way that mattered. and became something that existed in the pattern, something that the mountains recognized as belonging to them. The pain, when it came, was not physical. It was the sensation of thoughts reorganizing themselves around a framework that had been waiting for human consciousness to grow large enough to contain it. I saw simultaneously all the winters that had ever fallen in these mountains. I saw the things that had sheltered in caves and carved meaning into rock walls before anything called itself human. I saw the recognition beginning in the first person who understood that the mountains had memory. And I saw the moment when the National Park Service made its ancient compromise, agreeing to maintain places of safety for the old things in exchange for the old things maintaining a distance from the newer world. I understood the purpose of the rituals. They were bookkeeping, a way of marking human consciousness and integrating it into the older structure so that the human world and the older world remained in balance rather than collision. Most humans never recognized this. The rules of their civilization created blindness that kept them safe. But some humans, the ones who could see, the ones who worked alone in the wilderness long enough to understand, those humans required incorporation. I was not suffering. That was the greatest revelation. The change I was undergoing was neither torture nor transcendence. It was simply transformation, the same way a caterpillar transforms into a butterfly, a process of reorganization that seems violent from the perspective of the structure being reorganized but is simply natural from the perspective of the pattern. When the ice stopped cracking, I was standing in the same place and the others were still arranged in their circle, but my vision had shifted. I could see the patterns in the forest more clearly now. I could see the symbols in the stone and the meaning in the arrangement of branch and twig. I could see the way the seasons would arrange themselves across the year, and I could read, in the position of the stars, the names of the things that moved through the high mountains, the things that understood that humans were temporary visitors in a world that belonged to something far older. "You're complete," the thing that was becoming Kevin said. "You understand now." I did, and I understood that this account, this narrative I've been constructing throughout my isolation, is the last act of resistance that my human consciousness is capable of. I'm writing it down now because some part of me still believes that language matters, that transmitting understanding to other humans might be valuable, might change something. But I know better. The humans reading this will interpret it as horror, as fiction, as a cautionary tale. And that blindness is exactly what keeps the balance intact. The mountains are safe because humans can't actually see what they contain. The old things continue in the depth of the wilderness because human consciousness slides off their reality the way water slides off oiled stone. My name was never important. The position I held as ranger was never important. I was simply the vehicle through which recognition reached a necessary threshold. And now, as winter deepens and the mountains settle into their oldest patterns, I feel the human part of myself dissolving into the larger structure that the mountains maintain, the one that existed before words for such things were necessary and that will continue after humans have stopped thinking about parks and preservation and safety. The knocking at my cabin window continues, but now I understand that it's not an intrusion, it's a call home. And soon the season will turn, and I'll walk deeper into the places where humans no longer maintain trails, where the symbols on the stones tell stories that predate anything language can approximate. The lake freezes completely now. The ice is thick enough that it holds patterns like a permanent record, writing in frozen water the same symbols that appear in bark and bone and the arrangement of the oldest stones. By spring, the ice will melt, and those symbols will dissolve back into water and be carried downstream toward the human settlements. A message that humans will never fully read because human eyes aren't constructed to perceive the meaning contained in such things. But I can read them, and I understand finally why I came to Glacier, why I opened that door, why the mountains called and I answered. The refuge I was seeking was never away from human consequence. It was toward understanding, and the understanding, once complete, transforms the person who contains it into something that no longer requires the comforts of human society because human society is simply too small a frame to contain the pattern that the mountains maintain. The snow falls, the ice thickens, and the cabin where I'm writing this remains unlocked, waiting for the next ranger who accepts the position, the next human who believes they're seeking solitude and doesn't yet understand that solitude is simply the stage before recognition. And when they arrive, confused and afraid, they'll find my notes. And they'll make sense eventually once the mountains have had enough time to work on them, once the symbols have arranged themselves clearly enough in the branches and the stones. The cycle continues. It always continues, and now I'm part of the machinery that maintains it. My name is Marcus Reeves, and I've been a park ranger at Glacier National Park for 3 seasons now. People ask why I chose this isolated posting. Why I left a comfortable life in Helena to tend a remote cabin on Bowman Lake for 9 months out of the year. The honest answer is that I needed to disappear for a while. I was running from a marriage that dissolved like morning fog. Sarah wanted stability, routine, a man who came home at 5 o'clock. I couldn't give her that. Something in me has always pulled toward the edges of things, toward the places where civilization ends and the wilderness begins. When the National Park Service posted the position for a ranger at the northernmost station on Bowman Lake, I saw it as an answer to a question I'd been asking myself for years. The cabin sits 3 miles from the nearest maintained road, accessible only by foot or horseback. In winter, it becomes completely isolated. The lake itself is enormous, spanning nearly 3,000 acres, its waters cold enough to stop a heart in minutes. During my interview, the regional supervisor explained the responsibilities with practiced detachment: fire lookout duties, trail maintenance, search and rescue coordination, general ecological monitoring. What she didn't say, but what I understood completely, was that the job exists to keep someone present in a place that rarely sees human faces. I arrived in late April, when the last of the snow was melting from the higher elevations. The cabin needed work. Previous rangers had left it habitable but unremarkable, a functional structure of logs and stone with a wood stove that coughed more than it heated. I spent my first week cleaning, repairing the roof, and checking the perimeter for animal damage. There had been no bears that winter, at least not around the cabin, which seemed unusual to the old ranger I replaced. He mentioned it casually while we reviewed the log. "Strange year," Gregory said, running his weathered hand along the cabin's beam. "Usually we see sign by March. Fresh scat, overturned logs. Nothing this year, nothing at all." I didn't think much about it then. I was too caught up in the romance of being alone, in the silence that seemed to stretch infinitely in every direction. By June, I had established a routine. I hiked the perimeter trails twice a week, documented vegetation changes, checked monitoring equipment, and maintained the radio system. The work was meditative and isolating in equal measure. The first lost hiker came through in early July. Her name was Rebecca, though I didn't learn that immediately. What I knew first was that she was terrified. I found her on the eastern shore of the lake, stumbling between rocks with one arm cradled against her body. She'd been hiking the Bowman Lake Trail, separated from her group when someone suggested a shortcut they'd seen on an old map. "I've been walking for 14 hours, she told me, her voice cracked and hollow. "I keep coming back to the same place, that tall pine, the one with the scar. I pass it, and I keep walking, and then I see it again." I drove her to the hospital in Kalispell. Her arm was broken, but that wasn't the alarming part. The alarming part was the expression of complete wrongness in her eyes when she described the terrain. She insisted that familiar landmarks kept appearing where they shouldn't be, that the forest seemed to be repositioning itself around her. "It was like the trails were closing behind me," she said, "like something was herding me in circles." I filed the report and returned to my cabin. People get lost. It happens. They panic, lose their bearings, follow water downhill, and end up in strange places. The old topographical knowledge of the region would have made anyone disoriented on unfamiliar paths. But Rebecca's words lodged in my mind like a thorn. August brought the heat and the quietness. Tourists hiked the main trails near the lodge, but my stretch of the lake remained relatively untouched. I had established a rhythm that felt sacred somehow, the way monks speak of their hours in silence. I walked. I recorded. I listened. It was during one of these walks, on a ridge above the cabin, that I first noticed the scat. At first I thought it was a grizzly's mark. The scat was large, dark, and deposited in the middle of the trail in a way that seemed deliberate, placed like a warning. But the more I examined it, the less certain I became about its source. It contained bones, yes, but also what appeared to be fabric, a piece of blue cloth that I recognized as similar to what the missing hikers from 3 weeks prior had been wearing. I noted it in the log. I didn't yet report it, though I'm not sure why. Some instinct told me that reporting this would shift something, would move the situation from the realm of anomaly into something more serious, something that would bring investigators and scientists and would eventually drive me off the mountain. The cabin had begun to feel like the only safe place. By September, the hikers had thinned dramatically. The weather remained warm, but there was a quality to the light that suggested change. The aspens along the creek had begun turning, individual leaves catching the sun like small fires. It was beautiful in a way that made my chest ache. On the 15th of September, a man named David Pritchett came to my cabin. He'd taken the fire lookout trail from the south and appeared at my door in the late afternoon, his skin sunburned and his clothes torn. He said he'd been camping alone and had made the decision to hike out early because something didn't feel right. "I can't explain it," he said, accepting the coffee I offered. His hands shook as he held the mug. "The forest doesn't feel like a place anymore. It feels like something pretending to be a place." I drove him to town. He filed his own report with the ranger station, but when I checked on the details later, they seemed diminished somehow, the officials describing him as a nervous hiker prone to anxiety who had gotten spooked by normal forest sounds. That night, I searched the internet for articles about Glacier National Park. Most results were tourism pieces or trail guides. But when I refined my search, adding terms like disappearance and strange, I found something that made my blood move differently through my veins. Between 1968 and 1992, 17 hikers had gone missing in the glacier area. 17 in 24 years. The National Park Service had released a statement attributing the disappearances to common causes: disorientation, falls from heights, hypothermia, bear attacks. But I found forum posts from people who worked in the park, former rangers and researchers who hinted at something else. They mentioned an area north of Bowman Lake that locals avoided. They referenced old Kootenai and Blackfeet stories about the mountains that predated the park's establishment. One post, dated 2009, was written by someone named Wilderness Knower. It read, "My grandfather worked as a guide in the northern ranges before the federal government came in with their grids and their trails. He told me there were places that weren't fully in the world, places where the light behaved strangely and animals wouldn't go. He said the old people knew how to read these places, how to move through them without getting caught. He also said that something lived in those spaces and it learned from the hikers. It learned their shapes." I read that post 3 times, aware of how paranoid I sounded even in the privacy of my own cabin. October arrived with a vengeance. The temperature dropped 30 degrees in a week. I prepared the cabin for winter, stacking wood, checking the fuel, running the generator to make sure it would start. The solitude that had felt sacred now began to feel suffocating. I had developed a habit of walking at dusk, watching the light drain from the lake. It was during one of these walks that I first saw the tracks in the shape of a human footprint, but wrong. The spacing was incorrect. The pressure patterns didn't match anything a human gait would produce. They appeared on the trail above the cabin, and they led not toward the established path but directly into the dead zone. The area northeast of the cabin where the forest grew so thick that light struggled to penetrate. I began a systematic documentation. I photographed the tracks from multiple angles, measured them, recorded their location. I was thinking like a scientist, like someone who believed in data and verification, but my hands trembled while I worked. That night, I heard something at the cabin's perimeter. Not a sound exactly, but something that occupied the space where sound should be. A kind of attention directed at the structure. I stood at the window for hours, watching the darkness, aware that whatever was out there was also watching in. When dawn came, I found 3 distinct kinds of scat arranged in a semicircle around the cabin's north side. 3 different animals, I thought initially. Then I examined them more carefully and realized they were likely from the same creature, deposited in stages, as if something had remained in the area for an extended period, shifting between forms. I called the regional office. I spoke to a supervisor named Garrett who listened to my report with what I interpreted as professional concern. He asked me several questions, and I answered them as precisely as I could, omitting the parts that sounded paranoid. "We'll look into it," he said. "In the meantime, don't approach anything unusual. If you see the creature, stay inside and call for backup." "What do you think it is?" I asked. There was a long pause. "Could be a large predator. We've had wolves range further than usual. Could be a grizzly in unusual condition. Could be a lot of things." What he didn't say: "We don't know what it is, and we're not sure we want to." He sent a ranger named Paul Hendricks to investigate. Paul arrived in the 2nd week of October, and he spent 3 days examining the evidence I'd collected. He was polite, but visibly skeptical. He told me that the scat could be from a black bear in distress, that the tracks could be distorted by wet soil and leaf matter. He suggested that isolation and the approach of winter were contributing to a natural anxiety response. "These mountains have a way of getting into your head," he said before he left. Last ranger here before Gregory, Guy had a complete breakdown, started seeing shapes in the trees, had to be medevaced. I felt the comment was directed at me. The turning point came in late October, when the first serious snow fell. I woke to a world transformed, the familiar forest hidden beneath white, the lake a frozen expanse that seemed to extend toward infinity. It was beautiful and terrifying in equal measure. That day I received a radio call about a missing hiker. Her name was Jennifer, 28 years old, last seen at the Gunsight Pass trailhead. Her friends had returned without her, assuming she'd gone back to the car earlier. It was the standard search and rescue operation, except for two things. The trailhead was adjacent to the dead zone, and Jennifer had been hiking solo. I participated in the initial search, my knowledge of the local terrain making me more valuable than the rangers brought in from the main station. We found nothing that first day. The snow had covered the path, and the weather deteriorated quickly. By evening, visibility had dropped to 20 feet. On the morning of the second day, we found her. She was on the eastern shore of Bowman Lake, about a mile south of where I'd found Rebecca in July. She was alive but unresponsive. Her core temperature had dropped to 91 degrees, and she was suffering from severe frostbite despite being clothed adequately for early season hiking. Paramedics said she must have been outside for at least 18 hours. What alarmed me, and what I noted but didn't mention in the official report, was the expression on her face. She looked like she had been running, but her feet had carried her in the wrong direction, away from help and toward the frozen water. Later, when she regained consciousness in the hospital, she provided a statement that was later classified as unreliable due to her condition. "I kept seeing myself ahead of me on the trail," she said. "Just my shape, walking away. Every time I tried to catch up, there would be another one ahead. And the sounds of something breathing that wasn't me." She was discharged after 3 days with a diagnosis of acute hypothermia and acute stress disorder. The official record blamed the weather and poor trail familiarity. That night, I found something outside the cabin that changed everything. It was a section of a hiking boot, just the sole and part of the upper, placed on the wooden step leading to my door. The boot was from a style common in the 1980s, and it was positioned with the sole facing upward, as if placed deliberately for me to see. I kept the boot. I didn't report it. I couldn't explain why it was possible for someone to know, with such precision, where I would step. I began sleeping less. I would sit by the fire, watching the darkness press against the windows, and wait for evidence that something was moving through the darkness outside. Sometimes I saw shapes that might have been animals, but they moved in ways animals don't. They moved like something learning how to move that way, practicing the motions without fully understanding them. The dead zone had become a point of obsession. I studied old maps and found references to it in ranger logs dating back decades. A ranger named Whitmore, writing in 1957, had described it as a place where the forest seems to be aware of itself. Another, Hardin, had written in 1972, "The area northeast of the cabin contains a concentration of unusual animal behavior. I recommend all rangers avoid solo trips into the zone after dark." By 1985, the references had become more cautious. Ranger logs simply stated that the zone was off-limits for unauthorized personnel. No explanation was provided. I decided to enter the dead zone myself. I prepared carefully. I brought a rifle that I'd found in the cabin, cleaned and maintained by Gregory or one of the rangers before him. I brought a radio, a GPS, my phone with a fully charged battery, and a flashlight with new batteries. I brought water and energy bars. I brought everything a rational person brings when entering an irrational situation. The entrance to the dead zone was subtle. I noticed it only because I'd been searching for it. A gradual transition where the trees grew closer together and the light seemed reluctant to penetrate. I marked my entry point carefully, wrapping flagging tape around a distinctive pine. The interior was different. Not different in any way I could easily articulate, but different nonetheless. The air felt heavier. The quality of silence was different, as if sound itself had been partially removed from the environment. My footsteps made less noise than they should. My breathing seemed quieter. I walked for what I calculated to be 2 kilometers based on my pace, but the GPS insisted I had traveled only 600 meters. I looked behind me and could no longer see the marked entrance. The trees looked similar, stretched beyond my ability to differentiate. That's when I heard the footstep that wasn't mine. It was close, perhaps 10 meters behind me. A single step, deliberate testing. I turned, rifle raised, and saw nothing but trees and shadow. "Who's there?" My voice sounded foreign in that place, like something borrowed from elsewhere. No response. I began walking faster, the rational part of my mind insisting that I keep my bearings, that panic would be counterproductive. But underneath that was a deeper knowledge, something ancient and inarticulate, that told me I was being tracked. The footsteps continued. Sometimes one would echo just slightly off, leading from a direction where I could see nothing. Other times they would synchronize with my own pace so that I could almost convince myself they were my own feet creating a delayed echo. But they weren't. They were someone else, or something that was learning to be someone else. Then I saw movement ahead, a shape that resembled a human form but was slightly wrong in its proportions. It stood still, as if waiting for me to notice it. When our eyes met, I felt something twist behind my sternum, a physical response to the understanding that whatever was looking at me was not entirely human. It was wearing a hiker's jacket, blue Gore-Tex, the kind sold at outdoor retailers across the country. It was wearing this garment in the way a child wears an adult suit, the sleeves too long, the proportions inexact, and underneath the jacket, there were too many joints in its arms. I raised the rifle, and it moved toward me with a speed that shouldn't be possible for anything with that body structure. I fired without thinking, pulling the trigger reflexively. The shot echoed strangely in the dead zone, seeming to come from multiple directions at once. The creature didn't slow. It covered the distance between us in seconds, moving on limbs that bent in ways that created a desperate scrambling motion. I fired again, and again, the rifle bucking against my shoulder. At least one shot connected. I saw blood, dark and thin, spray across the blue jacket, but it didn't matter. It was on me, and its hands were shaped like hands but moved like something else entirely. I felt impact and pain, felt the wind driven from my lungs, and then I was on my back in the pine needles, and it was straddling my ribs, its face descending toward mine. Its face was the worst part. It was a face, objectively. Eyes, nose, mouth arranged in the correct configuration. But nothing about the proportions or the underlying structure was correct. It looked like someone's face had been interpreted by something that had only heard descriptions of human features, never witnessed them directly. I screamed. I thrashed. I felt my grip on the rifle slip away, felt the weight of it fall beside me. The creature's jaw opened further than any jaw should open, and I understood with absolute clarity that this was the moment I would die, and that no one would ever know what happened to me, because this place existed between human experience and human explanation. Then the shot came. The bullet caught the creature in the neck, snapping its head to the side with a violence that was almost beautiful. Ranger Paul Hendricks stood 15 meters away, his rifle still raised, his face locked in an expression of absolute professional focus. "Back away from it," he said, his voice rock steady. The creature made a sound that I will describe only as a wrong sound, a noise that something human-shaped should not be able to produce, and turned its attention away from me. It moved toward Hendricks with that scrambling gait, and he fired again, aiming for the center mass. The creature flinched but didn't slow. "Move," Hendricks shouted at me. I moved. I didn't think about it. My survival instinct, which had been trapped beneath the shock of what I was experiencing, suddenly flooded back in. I got to my feet and ran back toward where I thought the entrance was, ran toward anything that might be interpreted as a way out of that space. Behind me I heard more shots. I heard that wrong screaming sound again, this time overlapping with itself, as if there was more than one creature making the noise. I didn't look back. I don't remember finding the marked pine. I don't remember the transition from the dead zone to the normal forest. What I remember is breaking through the tree line onto familiar ground near my cabin and collapsing onto my knees. Hendricks found me 20 minutes later. He was alone, his jacket torn, a wound along his shoulder bleeding through his shirt. He had the rifle, and his hands were shaking. "We need to leave," he said. "Right now. Get your documents and anything you consider essential. We're driving to Kalispell tonight." "What was that?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "Nothing that the official reports would ever mention, nothing that anyone would believe, nothing that we're going to discuss with anyone, anywhere, ever." He helped me to my feet. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely retrieve my emergency bag from the cabin. I locked the door behind me, which seemed absurd considering what I had seen, but the habit of normalcy is strong. We drove in silence through the night. Hendricks wouldn't explain what he was doing at the dead zone that day, and I didn't ask. Some knowledge is heavier when it's shared. In the weeks that followed, I submitted my resignation citing personal reasons. The regional office accepted it with what I suspect was relief. Hendricks transferred to a different park 2 months later. The official incident report noted that I had become disoriented while hiking and had been located by a ranger search team. No mention of gunshots, no mention of creatures, no mention of the space that exists in the northern reaches of Glacier National Park where the rules of the world seem to bend just slightly wrong. I still receive the park's newsletter. I pay attention to the incident reports. Since I left, there have been no missing hikers in the Bowman Lake area. The dead zone is quiet, but I know what quiet means in that place. It means the creature is waiting, and I wonder sometimes if Hendricks succeeded in killing it, or if he merely wounded it, and if it's still learning, still trying to understand how to be human, gathering knowledge from every person it encounters. Last month I received a package with no return address. Inside was a used hiking boot, sole facing up, wrapped in blue Gore-Tex fabric. No note, no explanation. I haven't opened my doors much since then. The mountains, I've learned, have a way of reaching out toward you, of reminding you that you left something behind, and that you always owe a debt to the places that almost claimed you. I didn't go back. But sometimes, in the spaces between sleep and waking, I wonder if I ever really left at all.